Chapter 6:13. Everyone. In Ballard Room, King Kessel's voice came steadily, heavy, solemn, and resolute. Just like in the past, every time he made a decision for the Imperial Conference. It looked like the outcome was set. With this in mind, the ministers restrained their emotions and adjusted their posture. Some of them relaxed slightly, ready to welcome the end of another conference. But not this time. Under everyone's gaze, the Iron Hand King raised his head and swept his gaze across the ministers. All of you have a point. As he spoke, the king's right hand suddenly reached out from the shadow of the throne and flipped it gently at the crowd. His palm faced up and hovered over the meeting table. Just like a cold, unsheathed blade. Even the warm autumn sun could not reduce its chill. Gilbert, Cullen, Kirkuk, Sauter. All the ministers were stunned and did not understand what was going on. But the Iron Hand King remained expressionless and raised his right palm. You've thought it through. As they looked at each other, only the scar-faced spy from the Secret Intelligence Department's eyes flickered. He tactfully stepped forward and picked up the Jade City Substitute Servitude petition from the table. The scar-faced man walked past every stunned minister and respectfully and appropriately placed the letter into the king's palm. This letter is a barb with malicious intentions. King Kessel's voice came out quietly. It appears to be compromising, but in fact, it has seized on Renaissance Palace's weakness and is hiding a trump card. The king slowly lifted the letter up, revealing the iris print on it. We can't even make it public, or we'll be caught in a passive and unjust situation. Every servant who was swept by his gaze subconsciously tensed up and sat up straight. It's better to die for a friend than to perish for an enemy. Old Leinster had such a son. In the next second, the Iron Hand King's fingers suddenly tightened and crushed the letter. The few people who had their eyes fixed on the letter trembled and were startled. Only then did Kessel say calmly, "Living up to the family name." In the indescribable silence, the Minister of Trade, Viscount Kenny, coughed with difficulty and tried to forget the depression in his heart. He'll pay the price. Kenny bowed respectfully to the king. Just for this letter. King Kessel glanced at him without a word. The letter was still in his hand. Crumpled. Of course, Sauter ground his teeth hatefully, and also for his disrespect and disloyalty to you and your highness. Prime Minister Cullen's trembling voice sounded. But not this time. He seemed to have turned back into the doddering old man. He coughed and concluded the meeting. At the very least, the reduction of the recruits and the expansion of the regular army will have to wait until next season. At this moment. But it got out. The king's words came out of nowhere, as if he was mumbling to himself. No one could react in time. Pass what? Choka looked confused. Mine, your majesty? Sauter probed. I'll talk. At that moment, the king of the Iron Hand raised his eyes, which were particularly oppressive in the narrow Ballard Room. While we are talking, every sentence, every word, and every letter on this petition has been publicized, leaked, and spread by someone. Rumors are spreading everywhere. The conference room was silent for a moment. Gilbert was in disbelief. What? Viscount Kenny's surprised gaze kept darting back and forth. You mean this letter has been leaked? Prime Minister Cullen sat up straight and looked extremely serious. When? Why? However, the king only shook his head calmly and answered the truth. The Secret Intelligence Department is still handling it, but if it's unsatisfactory, I think it won't be long before everyone in the kingdom knows that Renaissance Palace is going to start with Jade City, change the traditional rules, strip the suzerains of their military power, reduce the recruits, and expand the regular army. All the way to the whole of Constellation. Renaissance Palace, Jade City, tradition, suzerains. With every word the Iron Hand King said, the chill in his tone intensified. The Prime Minister was the first to understand. His eyes widened slightly. That means, as you said just now, Bob, the king spoke in his calmest tone, not mincing words from the other party's mind. From the top to the bottom of Constellation, a huge uproar is about to break out. From this moment onwards, we are standing at the heart of the struggle. There's no retreat. The ministers quickly understood the meaning of this matter. The atmosphere suddenly became tense. What's going on? Who did it? Has the culprit been caught? What do we do now? Investigate the mastermind behind this. Amidst everyone's varying opinions and the same panic, the king leaned back thoughtfully and melted into the darkness. How could such an important exchange of letters be leaked? Advisor Sauter turned angrily to the other side and said accusingly, "What did the Secret Intelligence Department say? What about the rumors? What's the situation now?" Beside the conference table, the scar-faced spy from the Secret Intelligence Department bowed steadily. "We're still tracking down the source, encircling and intercepting it in an attempt to reduce the impact of the rumors." His tone was calm, as if what they were about to face was not a monstrous wave that could shake the country. But the delivery of the letter, the defense along the way, and the confidentiality of the palace are all fine. At this point, the scar-faced man's voice had an interesting rise and fall. "There's only one thing we can't take into account. This letter was delivered directly into the palace by the Duke of Iris Flower's messenger." Everyone suddenly fell silent. "You mean Zayn?" Prime Minister Cullen frowned. "When he delivered the letter, he made up his mind to leak the contents and spread the rumors?" The scar-faced man neither denied nor confirmed it. "We're still investigating." With a target in mind, the anger of the Imperial Conference erupted like a tidal wave. "Covendier, how dare he? Damn it! He's more cunning than his father. Did he fly into a rage out of humiliation and overturn the chessboard?" Among the officials, Gilbert only observed quietly at first, but at the end he sighed softly. Perhaps after the banquet, when His Majesty questions him for his crimes, the Foreign Affairs Minister put away his dazed expression and said tiredly, "Jade City saw our weakness from the terms of the negotiations." But Prime Minister Cullen scratched his chin and looked solemn. "Something's not right. Zayn is not a good person, but he's not a lunatic either. The fact that he wrote this letter is enough to prove his slyness and self-preservation." The Prime Minister pondered. "He's not stupid enough to force Renaissance Palace and himself into a dead end. That's even worse. It's done by someone else." Viscount Kenny looked suspicious. "Plotting against both of us at the same time. Someone is looking forward to chaos in the kingdom, just like back then." Amidst the chatter, the voice at the end of the long table rang out again. "It doesn't matter anymore." Everyone fell silent and looked at the king. Whether he did it or not, it doesn't matter anymore. A cold glint flashed in the king's eyes. The kingdom never lacks enemies. What's important is, how should we deal with it? After King Kessel said this, he let the petition slip from his fingers and fall between the sunset and the shadows. The wrinkled iris insignia faced the ceiling alone. A few seconds later, like a pride of lions awakened by a crisis, the Imperial Conference was no longer languid and slow, and everyone became shrewd and capable. "Let the Secret Intelligence Department work overtime. At the same time, we will send a letter to clarify and put an end to such rumors. We might be able to find some clues from the feudal nobles who have expressed their dissatisfaction recently. We have to be careful with the wording of the announcement, there may still be room for maneuver. We need to make contingency plans immediately for the reaction of the nobles, especially the feudal vassals. Send special envoys to appease the feudal lords of the grain-producing areas and explain to them. I'm afraid the preparations for the military reform will have to be delayed. We cannot leave any clues that could lead to misunderstandings." Amid the intense discussion, only Prime Minister Cullen and Gilbert remained silent. The former gazed at Covendier's letter quietly, while the latter quietly tidied up the documents beside him, both deep in thought. Meanwhile, Kessel V sat quietly in his seat, expressionless, indifferent, as if he was the only outsider. Bang. There was a muffled sound. It was military advisor Sauter striking the table with his palm, attracting the attention of the Imperial Conference. "Everyone!" Sauter's expression was solemn. His gaze was slightly hesitant, but it quickly became focused and determined. "I think at this point, things are unavoidable. Our next choice is actually simpler." Gilbert frowned and turned his head, as if he had expected something. "Sauter," Sauter said resolutely. "Since there's no way back, why not go forward with all our might?" At that moment, the military advisor was in high spirits. "Your Majesty, give Covendier a formal reply. Grant his petition, and announce to the nation that starting from Jade City, the military reform is imperative." Everyone was stunned. Or rather, they were shocked by this suggestion. "Sauter, have you thought about the consequences?" Gilbert said with difficulty amid the silence, "including what we just discussed." "Of course." Sauter turned around and interrupted him. "But at this point, our plan to take things slowly has gone south. We have no chance to disguise ourselves. Nor do we have room for compromise. Sodder paused. His voice turned fierce. We do it. Or never do it again. There's no such thing as next time. His gaze swept across the room. Many of his colleagues could not help but lower their heads to avoid his gaze. Some looked solemn, while others hesitated to speak. Only the king at the end of the long table remained silent, as if deep in thought. But Sodder could not care less. He waved his hand. Kirkuk, find the money. The chief of finance raised an eyebrow. What? Sodder stared at the chief of finance. If Jade City did it, then we don't have to count on their financial aid. But under these circumstances, the military reform must be put on the agenda. According to the previous plan, we should first reduce the Jade Star private army from the vassals directly under the royal family around Eternal Star City, and expand the regular army. Only then will we have the strength to deal with what comes next. Kirkuk paused for 3 seconds, then became exasperated. All right, let's not talk about the fact that the situation might not be that bad, and let's not talk about the fact that His Majesty hasn't agreed to your rotten idea. Our budget is already very tight. Once this letter is leaked and causes trouble, the financial pressure will only increase. If there's no revenue, we might even have to use other sources to make up for it, such as the salaries of the officials, or even increase taxes. That would be even worse. Kirkuk was in a great deal of trouble. Moreover, reorganizing an army is not as simple as registering and creating a register. Even if you have prepared all the officers who are waiting to be incorporated, do you know how many Jade Star private soldiers who are called up at the right time cost to maintain a regular soldier, from the salary, equipment, logistics, and station? I know. Sodder slammed his fist on the meeting table, startling everyone. Kirkuk, I know your difficulties, but I understand your anger even more. He shouted angrily. Whether it's the indignation you felt when you were fooled by those southern bumpkins with their account books when collecting taxes, or the anger you felt when Covendier turned the tables on His Majesty, I can relate to it all. Kirkuk pursed his lips. Sodder stood up abruptly, pressed his arms on the table, and leaned forward. But I swear to you, Kirkuk, the regular army is the key to changing all this. Expansion and restructuring are just the beginning. There was an indescribable fanaticism in Saldus' expression, which made Prime Minister Cullen frown involuntarily. The price of a moment is for the future prosperity of the kingdom. And one day, the kingdom's wrath will personally walk into Jade City's Palace of Clarity with His Majesty's decree, surrounded by countless soldiers, and persuade Zayn Covendier and his cunning accountants to pay their taxes honestly, and recover all of today's costs. It's a sure win without loss. At this point, Saldus' eyes shone with an unquestionable light. A sure win without loss? Kirkuk answered Sodder with a sneer. Yes, when I was young, I had a relative who liked to gamble. He said the same thing when he came to my house to borrow money for business, until he was taken away by the Blood Bottle Gang loan sharks. At this point, the chief of finance got up from the back of his chair and leaned forward. What's the difference between you and him? A gambler? The conflict between the two made everyone frown. The military advisor clenched his fists. The emotion in his eyes turned from disappointment to anger. Why don't you understand? Sodder said bitterly. With a regular army, you'll have money. Why don't you understand? Kirkuk was equally displeased. Without money, you won't have a regular army. Then find the money. Saldus' furious roar shook Ballard Room. You're the chief of finance of the kingdom. Be a beggar, sell your ass, even if you have to borrow from loan sharks, for the sake of the kingdom, find me that damn budget for army expansion. The two men's disrespectful shouting made their colleagues frown. But the Prime Minister and the rather prestigious Foreign Affairs Minister, who were supposed to be presiding over the meeting, did not make a sound. The king, on the other hand, remained motionless on his throne. You finally King got one thing right. Soldiers. Kirkuk stood up. Although he was a head shorter than Sodder, he did not lose in terms of grandeur. I'm the chief of finance. Remember? Last year, it was precisely your military affairs sector that shamelessly boasted here, bragged about the benefits of sending troops to the heavens. You forced the Department of Finance to approve the budget, forced the Department of Agriculture to contribute rations, forced the Department of Foreign Affairs to open up a path for you, forced the Secret Intelligence Department to pave the way for you, and inexplicably sent a large number of regular soldiers, retired, active, reserve, training, and new conscripts, to Blade Fang's camp. Sent to Western Desert. Sent to the desert. The expressions of the people at the Imperial Conference changed as they recalled the incident with sorrow. Without that unprofitable business of yours, would we need to ask Jade City for money? Would we have been fooled by Covendier like that? Kirkuk glanced at the colleagues around him who agreed with him and said darkly, "What, do you want to do it again?" Hey! Sauder clenched his fists. That was to welcome back Prince Thales, the Jade Star bloodline, the heir to the kingdom. You're absolutely right. Kirkuk retorted angrily. Then go ask him for money. Sauder was so infuriated by this scoundrel's quibble that he was rendered speechless. Kirkuk, be careful with your words. Gilbert could not take it anymore. He stopped him sternly. Sit down, don't be disrespectful in front of the Emperor. Kirkuk sat down and even banged his chair to express his displeasure. Sauder snorted angrily and sat down heavily, but had no intention of extinguishing the flames of war. Stop being so sarcastic, shirking responsibility and pretending to be innocent, moneybag. About sending troops to Western Desert to welcome back the prince, you knew about it and even supported it. You had your own selfish motives and were trying to profit from it. It was Kirkuk's turn to be stunned. Me? Selfish motives? Profit? Kirkuk was caught off guard, shocked and angry. Very well, you coarse country bumpkin who grew up planting grapevines. But Sauder did not hold back. He pointed at Kirkuk's nose. I only figured it out after the banquet. But that's right, Kirkuk, it's you. After the Desert War, many nobles in the Central Territory targeted Western Desert, where the situation had changed drastically, and illegally invaded and annexed land for personal gain. Now the deadline for the land assessment order is approaching, and they're trying every means possible to clear their names. Kirkuk's face paled. Back then, you supported our expedition to the desert, and even privately bribed several frontline officers, all because you wanted the regular army to cause a huge commotion and turmoil in Western Desert. You wanted to catch these greedy nobles and landlords off guard, force them to give themselves away, and turn them into a rolling source of income for the Department of Finance to confiscate and confiscate. The news that the military advisor revealed was no trivial matter. The Imperial Conference was in an uproar, and King Kessel's gaze shifted. Kirkuk was exasperated. That slandering nonsense. I have the names of those officers. Why do you want to confront them? Or have the Secret Intelligence Department investigate? Your Majesty, Kirkuk was extremely anxious, but he was tongue-tied. Sauder gritted his teeth and pressed on. For this reason, you even secretly leaked the news of the regular army's expedition to the west. And that unlucky Doyle of Mirror River who got into trouble at the royal banquet? They're just one of the fat sheep on your list. At the Imperial Conference, the ministers were surprised and could not help but look at Kirkuk in a new light. Viscount Kenny coughed and asked worriedly, Well, my father-in-law's family also has a few businesses in the Western Desert. You wouldn't? How could I, Lord Kenny? Kirkuk smiled obsequiously. But he immediately turned to the king and put on a mournful face. Your Majesty, I was just that. King Kessel just stared at him with narrowed eyes. Kirkuk, you're indeed moneybag. Gilbert saw Kirkuk's expression and guessed the truth. He could not help but sigh. No wonder they say that you can even take money out of your crotch. You're good at making money, and can support the kingdom. Kirkuk's cheek twitched. Yes. On the other side, Prime Minister Cullen snorted and added a sentence with an unclear meaning. Someone else's crotch. Sauder snorted angrily, his attitude self-evident. Under everyone's gaze, Kirkuk swallowed hard and hurriedly raised his hand. All right, Your Majesty, listen to me. That's right. We originally had a few extra fines and forfeitures from this expedition, which can be included in the next quarter's budget. The Doyle family? Gilbert said in a low voice. Kirkuk froze, sensing the suspicion in everyone's eyes. His voice immediately weakened. He took a deep breath. That's right. But the Doyle family deserved it. Over the years, they've crossed the border to occupy land, illegally rented tenancies, smuggled taxes, concealed the population, and violated tradition. All these crimes should have been dealt with long ago. Our Department of Finance is dedicated to the kingdom and does things impartially. Cut the crap. Where's the money? Sauder ignored his excuses and went straight to the point. Now, it's been several months since the prince's return, and our mission is complete. Your Department of Finance should be full by now, right? The military advisor was aggressive. Why did you make all sorts of excuses during the Imperial Conference about being poor? When South Coast Hill forced us into a corner, you still held onto your wallet tightly and obstructed His Majesty's military reform. Was both shocked and angry at the same time at this accusation. I. He looked around, but none of his colleagues dared to interrupt. Saldus' gaze was sharp and threatening. Kirk felt dizzy. He had to take a deep breath and yelled at the top of his lungs, "Prince Thales!" As soon as these words came out, everyone was stunned again. "What?" Sodder asked, puzzled. Kirk panted a few times and said angrily, "I'm sorry, I didn't want to say what I'm about to say here after all." He calmed his breathing and said in resignation, "That's right. Sodder, based on the standard of the regular army, Doyle's case is enough for you to expand the staffing of 800 to 1,000 heavy cavalry, plus their squires, equipment, logistics and perhaps more." Sodder slammed the table and mouthed, "I knew it." But Kirk changed the topic. "But after Prince Thales, I mean the incident at the banquet, Doyle's case was exposed to the public. From a simple case, it became a hot potato that attracted the attention of the entire nation. Even the case files were taken away by the kingdom's secret intelligence department overnight." Someone could not help but turn around. The scar-faced man from the kingdom's secret intelligence department was expressionless, as if he had not heard anything. Sodder frowned. "Western Desert is vast. Your sources of income are definitely not limited to just them." Kirk sighed pitifully. "Yes. But don't forget, Prince Thales stood up for the Doyle family last night in the name of His Majesty. Now everyone thinks that Doyle is backed by the Duke of Star Lake, the heir to the kingdom. This has implicated our other cases. Now, no one dares to touch anything that involves land annexation or the old and new nobles, let alone handle it." Saldus' expression changed slightly. Kirk said angrily, "So when I said, ask Prince Thales for money, that's true." Gilbert rebuked him angrily. Kirk reacted and waved his hands regretfully. I know. That's why I said sorry. I didn't want to say that either." No one dared to speak rashly when the matter involved the royal family. Many stole glances at the king at the end of the long table. But King Kessel remained unmoved, as if what Kirk had just complained about was not his son and heir. The chief of finance regained his composure. Seeing that no one spoke up, he regained some of his confidence. "All right, let's not talk about the prince. So don't always blame it on me, soldier. If you had done a better job in Western Desert, more frugal, more efficient, and more profitable, would we have ended up in this state?" Sodder wanted to retort, but hesitated again and again. "For more than half a year, we mobilized a large force, traveled a long distance, and even fought a war with our own family for no reason. How much money and rations did we waste in total?" Kirk spoke more and more smoothly, to the point that he slammed the table fiercely. His voice spread clearly throughout the narrow meeting room. "And what did you bring back?" "Aha, a report saying that you were going to expand the army. We ate up such a large sum of the kingdom's budget, but not only did we not accomplish anything, not to mention the spoils of war, we didn't even earn back the money we spent on horseshoes. What else do you want?" Sodder could not hold it in any longer. He slammed the table and stood up. "Do you want my warriors to shed blood in Western Desert and attack the ruins? Plunder Wing Fort? Or take over Brave Soul's Fort? Ransack the homes of all the local nobles? Do you want to burn the entire Western Desert to the ground and send all the spoils of war to the Department of Finance, so that you won't have to complain so much when you're sitting here leisurely counting your copper coins?" Kirk scoffed. "Then why don't you do it? And the result? It turns out that you were just there for a vacation. Even the prince himself was sent back by the Western Desert nobles." The military advisor said angrily. "Do it. His Royal Highness' whereabouts are uncertain in Western Desert, and you even took a sword and a flag from them. Chroma and Bosdorf escorted him back to the capital in a grand manner, and they were very respectful. What can we do? What should we do? What should we do?" Kirk, who had regained his confidence and was knowledgeable, said without fear, "Then why are you yelling at me? To find the prince. Why don't you tell him about your suffering? Ask him why he mixed with the enemy, blocked your army, cut off my source of income, and even gave Covendier an opportunity to take advantage of him." Everyone was at a loss, and His Majesty was in a dilemma. In the end, he ruined the kingdom's military reform. Enough, both of you, Gilbert reminded him sharply. You'll never understand, moneybag. Sodder was so angry that he laughed. He did not hear the Foreign Affairs Minister's reprimand at all. You'll only see the reflection of copper coins and hear the hum of gold coins. You'll never understand the meaning of us sending troops to Western Desert. You won't understand that for the kingdom. Thud. Thud. Everyone turned in unison to see the scar-faced spy from the Secret Intelligence Department standing apologetically. On the ground was a broken teapot. I'm sorry. The scar-faced man hurriedly bowed. It's my fault. I was just thirsty. Only then did the officials turn their heads around. Yes, Prime Minister Cullen mumbled with his head lowered, but his eyes lit up. It's indeed your fault. Interrupted, Sodder and Kirkuk snorted and sat back in their seats, turning their heads away from each other. But the Foreign Affairs Minister was furious. Sodder, Kirkuk, watch your language. This has nothing to do with His Highness Thales. Gilbert's words were harsh. His Highness's body is priceless. His safe return to the capital is the greatest contribution to the kingdom. Nothing else. And don't forget, we are here to discuss countermeasures to deal with the predicament brought about by the leak of this letter. This is a kingdom's official business. Don't turn this into a personal grudge. Sodder and Kirkuk's expressions softened a little. But the Prime Minister coughed at that moment. Don't blame them, Count Casso. Sodder and Sir Kirkuk had no choice either. Duke Cullen shook his head. Whether it's the expedition to Western Desert or the royal banquet, it's His Highness's fault for appearing at such a coincidental time. Just like this letter. The Prime Minister shook his head at the king, implying something. He's forced us into a tight spot. There's no other way. Chapter 6:14. The ministers shuddered as they listened to Prime Minister Cullen's words. Gilbert could read between the lines and could not help feeling anxious. Prime Minister. At that moment, a third voice joined the discussion. In fact, if the kingdom has no other choice but to bite the bullet, perhaps. The unfamiliar voice attracted the attention of most of the people. The ministers turned to the interlocutor, the only participant in the imperial conference who did not speak, the Archdeacon of the Sunset Church, Stylia Nysides. Stylia Nysides nodded slightly. I can try to persuade the Sunset Church to invest in solving the problem of expanding the regular army? Many people frowned. What? You? Sodder asked suspiciously. In the corner of the conference table, the Archdeacon smiled and nodded humbly. Guy Stylia Nysides, the Archdeacon of the Central Diocese of the Sunset Church, attending the imperial conference in place of the ailing Archbishop Xenon. I know who you are, kid, Advisor Sodder interrupted rudely. Say, you can find the money we want? The Archdeacon named Guy smiled slightly, then closed his eyes in a prayer gesture. I can't guarantee anything, but I'll try my best. Seeing how straightforward the Archdeacon was, Advisor Sodder looked doubtful. If I remember correctly, in the central Sunset Temple of the King's City, Chief Priest Diallo was the one who opposed the standing army system the most. He once said, the standing army fights for money, greedy and despicable, while the conscripts fight for their duty, holy and respectable. Guy's tone was modest. Yes, most of the archdeacons of the Sunset Temple are of noble birth. They come and go from castles and palaces, and have close relationships with the nobles and dukes. But we're different, Sir Sodder, the Archdeacon said firmly. The Sunset Church is not the Sunset Temple. The Sunset Church. Sodder was silent for a while. He collected himself and looked at the priest with a serious gaze. Who did you say you were? On the other side, Prime Minister Cullen said with a look of understanding, a battle of faith between the temple and the church, the ministry of priests and the ministry of evangelism, the archdeacons and the bishops. The archdeacon turned to the Prime Minister and smiled warmly. No, this has nothing to do with faith, but politics and standpoint. The temple is close to the dukes, and the church is close to His Majesty. It's that simple. If we can reduce the influence of the temple by reducing the conscripts and increasing the regular army, the bishops of the church will be happy to see it. Hearing this, many people began to ponder. Cullen's gaze flickered. Oh, as a believer of the sunset goddess, you really don't hide at all? Cover up. Guy shook his head indifferently. No faith can exist independently of politics, and no religion is not related to power struggles. To avoid politics and talk about faith is to abandon humanity and only ask about divinity. This is a disguise and disguise. This is the contempt and contempt for faith. It is disrespect and dishonesty to the sunset goddess. Even the king at the end of the long table raised his head slightly. Kulun was taken aback when he heard the rebellious words. He raised his brows and said, I think I know why Gilbert recommended you. Compared to those priests who are full of holy teachings, you are indeed a bit more interesting. Gilbert forced a smile. Archdeacon Guy sighed. Thank you for your praise, but not everyone understands this principle, especially the priests of the Divine Hall. Therefore, it is not convenient for the Church to intervene in the kingdom's military affairs in the form of direct funding. Sauter, who was most concerned about this matter, instantly put on a cold expression. Then what do you mean? Guy turned to him and said seriously, to support the expansion of the regular army, the Sunset Church must have a valid reason. Reason? Many people's expressions changed slightly. Guy looked respectfully at the end of the long table. If His Majesty can change the tradition and allow our priests to join the regular army of the royal family, I will be more confident in persuading the bishops to invest. Sauter was taken aback. But we already have military priests. Every time there is a war, the temple will send a qualified officiant to preside over the expedition ceremony. Guy's lips curled up and he nodded calmly. Banish them. What? Sauter was incredulous. I suggest, Sir Sauter, that you banish the regular army's military priests and replace them with military priests, Archdeacon Guy explained patiently. Whatever the temple can do for the regular army, the church can do as well, or even more. Sauter understood Guy's words. His expression changed back and forth in those few seconds. The others in the meeting looked at each other. The king's gaze was still distant and unfamiliar. Prime Minister Kulun snorted. The Sunset Temple's officiants will never like it. Guy turned his head around, and his words were sharp. The temple doesn't like many things. For example, the regular army of the royal family. But this was originally a political issue. With your intervention, it has become a religious conflict, Kulun shook his head and said. It has always been a tradition for priests to accompany the army, no matter, Guy calmly replied. Yes, just like how suzerains regularly recruit militia, it has also been a tradition, until the emergence of the regular army of the royal family. Saldus' eyebrows twitched. The archdeacon looked at the dispirited chief of finance. And if we have military priests, the Sunset Church will be able to allocate a permanent fund from the believers' donations, justifiably subsidizing a portion of the regular army's costs, and relieve the pressure on the Department of Finance. This is something that the lofty and self-proclaimed Orthodox temple cannot do. The initially bored Kirkirk perked up. His beady eyes sparkled. It's not that we can't consider it? On the other side, the military advisor was silent for a few seconds. He asked cautiously, in that case, the Sunset Church can fund the expansion of the regular army, provided that His Majesty grants permission for your priests to join the regular army of the royal family to replace the military priests, right? The archdeacon smiled. Of course not. But his gaze changed. But without this bargaining chip, I'm not that confident in convincing the bishops. Sauter scoffed. This is blackmail and profiteering from a burning house. This is more for the kingdom, Guy swiftly retorted. The priests of the temple are basically of noble birth, and are related to the various feudal lords. They are naturally at odds with the regular army. Following the army is just a story. And us priests are mostly born poor, and are used to educating the lower classes. We will be more competent, more capable, more passionate, and more suitable for the regular army than the priests. Yes, that's exactly what I'm worried about, Sauter sneered. At this point, King Kessel suddenly snorted. His meaning was unclear and intriguing. I say, Guy, you're a priest who serves the gods. On the other side, Prime Minister Cullen narrowed his eyes. Full of benefits and calculating bargaining chips, don't you think that's too vulgar? Vulgar. Stylianides smiled. The king of Renaissance's faith teacher and close comrade, Brother Mohatsa the prophet, famously said, theology is the knowledge of men. Gilbert stirred slightly. Divinity exists in human nature, and human nature carries divinity. Only by exhausting every corner of human nature can we hope to find that glimmer of divinity. Guy smiled. Who says the secular world isn't holy? There's a kingdom of heaven in the mortal world. Ah, you're not just a little interesting guy, the Prime Minister's tone changed. You're also very scary. The Archdeacon made another prayer gesture, very devoutly. The goddess test always makes the path of truth seem more treacherous and rugged. No. After a few moments of hesitation, Sauter figured it out and firmly rejected the offer. The regular army of the royal family does not require priests to accompany them. He said decisively, the regular army cannot be restricted by forces other than His Majesty, especially in terms of financial resources. As Sauter said this, he glanced at King Kessel. But to his disappointment, the king remained unmoved. Guy was unperturbed and continued the discussion. If it's limited by the form of payment, we can discuss it. For example, the church can donate the money to the Department of Finance, and the Department of Finance can allocate it to the budget of the Ministry of Military Affairs. Sure. The Chief of Finance's eyes lit up. If this succeeds, you'll have saved my life, Guy. Stylianides nodded politely. Thanks to the goddess, I dare not claim credit. But Saldus' attitude remained the same. What's the difference? Constellation spent 500 years, with endless sacrifices and bloodshed, to drive religion and theocracy back to the temple. As long as I'm in charge of the Ministry of Military Affairs, history will not regress. Sauter spoke with certainty and uncompromising. That's not necessarily the case, Kirkuk muttered. Based on your stance just now, you're probably willing to make anyone prime minister if they can help you expand the regular army. Saldus' expression stiffened. Then I'll thank the heavens. Prime Minister Cullen sighed and shifted his large buttocks that covered the entire chair. Please do, Archdeacon Guy. Archdeacon Guy smiled humbly at them. I understand your concern, Sir Sauter, but what you've said is a lesson learned long ago. The priests of the temple fell into the self-righteous path of the youngest, arrogant, greedy and corrupt, allowing their selfish desires to overshadow the public, condoning lies to obscure the truth, flaunting the might of the gods for worldly gain, fighting for power through faith, and never turning back. Archdeacon Guy nodded, as gentle as ever. And it was precisely because my ancestors, the priests of the missionary department, saw their mistakes that they broke away from the temple and established themselves, upholding the teachings of the goddess, and established the Sunset Church. It's been nearly 4 centuries since then. The head priest and the archbishop are not subordinate to each other. The priest department and the missionary department abide by their boundaries. We do not. Sauter waved his hand impatiently and cut him off. The temple or the church, the priests or the priests, in my opinion, there's no difference, they're all jackals of the same tribe. When we were weak, we asked for help, of course we'd be obedient. When we're strong, we're greedy and bound to take a mile when given an inch. He said warily, times have changed. The days when the Sunset Temple had unlimited authority and hundreds responded to a single call, and even dared to challenge Renaissance Palace and interfere in the succession of the throne are gone forever. These words sent a chill through the entire imperial conference. Guy heaved a long sigh, making no attempt to conceal his disappointment. I understand, Sir Sauter. It looks like the wishes of the priests to serve the country can only be realized in the future. At the end of the long table, the king's cold gaze was once again overshadowed by the setting sun. In that case, in the face of such a dilemma, it's unlikely to force through military reform, Prime Minister Cullen, who presided over the imperial conference, said with a sigh. Hearing this, Sauter glared at Kirkuk again. Don't look at me. If you want money, Guy and the church have it. Kirkuk knew what the other party was thinking and was unconcerned. As for whether you want it or not, it's up to you. It's not just a matter of money. Unexpectedly, Prime Minister Cullen spoke up again, interrupting the dispute over military wealth that was about to erupt once again. This caught the attention of all the officials. In fact, speaking of the prince's banquet, I thought of something else. Duke Cullen's eyes burned. Last night, that minor Western Desert noble made a scene at the royal banquet, but was saved by Duke Thales. Gilbert furrowed his brows. This inevitably reminds people that His Highness returned to the country under the protection of the Western Desert Army, and that sort of fakin' has. This could easily give people false expectations, or even be interpreted as the royal family's stance. Things will be troublesome, especially at this juncture? Cullen shook his head as he spoke, seemingly extremely regretful. Prime Minister. Gilbert reminded him sternly. Cullen shuddered slightly, as if he had just understood, and smiled apologetically. But after hearing the Prime Minister's words, Many people nodded thoughtfully. Right, the Doyle family in question. The Minister of Agriculture, Lord Croppen, who had not spoken much all day, spoke up. Their Mirror Lake district has been a major grain-producing region for the past few years, and also an important source of soldiers for the Jade Star Private Army and the Central Regular Army. Moreover, they are part of the 7 Jade Star attendants, which may affect the attitudes of the other families. This will also affect the process of military reform. He looked at everyone cautiously. I think we need to determine the nature of the case as soon as possible, sort out the clues, and make a judgment. Indeed, the incident at the royal banquet has brought us a lot of trouble, whether it is the upcoming military reform or this letter. King Kessel's figure moved slightly on the throne. Viscount Kenny glanced in the direction of the king. Seeing that he did not react, he cleared his throat. Forgive me for being blunt, but I heard that Mindy's Hall has become the new place that everyone in the capital flocks to. Look at the Doyle family, they made a huge mess, but His Highness still risked his life to protect them. I do not want to criticize Duke Thales, but his attitude at the banquet is sometimes easy to misunderstand. Kenny! Gilbert sensed the direction of the meeting, and he was shocked and angry. There is no problem with His Highness's handling of the matter at the royal banquet. He is merciful, magnanimous, and impartial. Governor Kukirk shrugged his shoulders. But now, looking at this letter, what we need the most is merciful and magnanimous. Viscount Kenny nodded in agreement and added, and impartiality. Gilbert was incredibly anxious. Regardless of the consequences, His Highness has saved 2 lives and 2 families with his superb skills, preventing a worse situation. But it is a barbaric method of a bloody duel, another voice said. May the setting sun forgive him. Gilbert turned his head around in disbelief and stared at his best friend. Guy! Archdeacon Stylianides nodded apologetically. Before I entered the palace, the bishops were discussing this matter. The officials exchanged glances and understood each other's intentions. The archdeacon made a penitential salute. With the setting sun as witness, the Duke of Star Lake dueling in person and resorting to the ancient rites of barbarism and heresy, that's a terrible signal and demonstration. No, that happened at night. Prime Minister Cullen scoffed sarcastically. It should be, witness of the North Star. All the officials in front of the Emperor lowered their heads. Gilbert sucked in a deep breath and explained to his good friend. Guy, my friend, as far as I know, the duel was unreasonably proposed by the other party, and Prince Thales agreed to the duel out of pity. Putting himself in danger was just an expedient measure. Guy nodded in understanding. Of course, I understand the prince's difficulties, and I admire his benevolence, magnanimity, intelligence and wisdom. But do you think that after this story spreads throughout the kingdom? Duke Cullen clicked his tongue and shook his head. When people mention a duel, will the first thing they think of is the prince's benevolence or Jade Star's violent duel? Gilbert furrowed his brows. The archdeacon smiled as well. What Lord Cullen said is not without reason. Just like how the bishops of the church are also worried. In Northland, the Extension warriors may have given His Highness the courage to fight to the end, but they also numbed His Highness' thoughts in the midst of violence and bloodshed, causing him to not reject the barbaric and backward ancient rites. Gilbert stared at his good friend deeply. He could not hide his disappointment. And the king still did not move. As time goes by, His Highness, as the heir to the kingdom, has not avoided heretical beliefs and rites time and time again. Guy's tone became worried. This will have a profound impact on people's attitudes and ways of doing things, causing young people to be hot-blooded, desperate people to take risks out of desperation, and imitators to advance wave after wave. This will be greatly detrimental to the kingdom's existing governance. Moreover, the goddess will not be happy to see her believers bleed because of barbaric duels, and the same goes for her believers. Count Croppen looked at everyone's expression and interjected with great interest. That I also think. Enough! The Foreign Affairs Minister's rare outburst of anger silenced the gossiping crowd. Everyone! His Majesty did not summon us to this room for us to judge right from wrong and pursue the matter to its roots. Gilbert's breathing quickened. He stood up and glanced angrily at each of his colleagues. Sodder, I know that the regular army's expedition to the Western Desert has involved a great deal of effort, but it was not a complete success. You have your own difficulties and are brooding over it. The military advisor pursed his lips. Chief Kirkirk, I also understand that the accident at the banquet caused the Department of Finance to lose a considerable amount of forfeiture money and caught you off guard. The Chief of Finance crossed his arms in annoyance. As for the Prime Minister, you are trying your best to avoid unnecessary conflict between Renaissance Palace and the vassals, so you have used His Highness as a target to divert attention. The plump old Duke chuckled nonchalantly. Viscount Kenny, please be rest assured that no matter how popular His Highness is, or how he recruits talents, it will not affect your position as a pillar of the King's support party. The Minister of Commerce's expression darkened slightly. As for Guy, old friend, I swear to you that it is not His Highness' fault that you failed to become the Prince's theology tutor, and it does not mean that His Highness is closer to the temple. The Archdeacon closed his eyes and lowered his head. And Lord Croppen, you have been silent for the entire day, and that is already smart enough. Echoing the crowd at the end will not make you look smarter. The Minister of Agriculture coughed in embarrassment. Gilbert took a deep breath and calmed his emotions after he made all the officials in front of the Emperor shut their mouths. He resisted the urge to look at the figure at the end of the long table. That's right. I can feel it. I know that all of you have your reasons, your thoughts, and your resentment, the Foreign Affairs Minister said solemnly. But, all of you, I implore you to put yourselves in the Prince's shoes and understand his situation. Then you will understand that for the kingdom, His Highness has many times no choice, many things he has to do, and many encounters are beyond his expectations. And he has done his best in those tasks that he should have completed. Gilbert slowed down his speech and unknowingly, there was a hint of regret in his voice. From the National Conference to Dragon Cloud City, from the Great Desert to Mindy's Hall, in the face of the covetous Northland vassals and the turbulent domestic politics, any one of us, even His Majesty, even Prince Midir back then, could not have done better than him. His voice was loud and impassioned, and it shook Ballard Room. Not to mention that we all owe him a favor, be it for stopping the Northlanders from moving south, or stabilizing the Jade Star royal family and Constellation's political situation. On the throne, King Kessel leaned against the back of his chair again. His gaze was distant, and no one knew what he was thinking. As for the other unexpected consequences caused by Thale's actions, be it the chaos in the Western Desert, Doyle's case, the duel, the dispute, or this damned letter and the predicament it brought, they are, in fact, the result of our lack of consideration and planning. This is the dereliction of duty and incompetence of our servants, and it is the responsibility that we should bear. Gilbert exhaled, paused for a moment, and looked at everyone. Everyone turned their heads away to avoid eye contact with him. When Gilbert said this, he felt bitter. Shift the blame to His Highness? This will not cover up our incompetence, nor will it solve more problems. And that child should not be responsible for a mistake that he is unaware of. At this moment, Duke Cullen suddenly spoke. Even if he is a Jade Star? Gilbert's expression changed. He turned around abruptly and showed no signs of weakness. It is precisely because he is a Jade Star. Prime Minister Cullen frowned. After pausing for a few seconds, the Prime Minister sighed. I know, Count Casso, you are his teacher. But Gilbert quickly interrupted him. I am not saying this just because he is my student. Gilbert turned around and faced his other colleagues. His tone was resolute and brooked no room for doubt. It is also because of Prince Thales himself. Whether it is his courage and achievements in going north as a hostage, his experience in traveling thousands of miles back to the country, or his courage in saving people at the banquet, all of these prove that he is worthy of being the Jade Star descendant, the Duke of Star Lake, and the bloodline of the kingdom. When he said this, Gilbert's voice trembled slightly. We should all feel honored and proud to have such a prince. We should be the long swords in his hands, not the stones in his boots. We should help him, not obstruct him. When he finished speaking, Gilbert raised his hand and pressed it against his eyes. He took a few deep breaths. The Imperial Conference was silent. The king's gaze was still like a sharp blade in the snow, emitting a cold glare. Vice Bishop Guy sighed and patted Gilbert's arm, gesturing for him to sit down. Gilbert. Gilbert flung his friend's arm away and took a deep breath. Please forgive me, everyone. He tried hard to adjust his emotions and calm his tone. Just as your Majesty said, I am tired and old. Ballard Room was silent. At least you are not fat. Prime Minister Cullen took over the conversation. He was a little dispirited and sentimental. I will not be an eyesore to certain people. This sentence had a profound meaning, and no one dared to continue. That was until the King of Constellation tapped her fingers lightly and broke the dull atmosphere. Gilbert. Kessel V's gaze was directed at him. He could not hide the complicated and subtle tone in his voice. Old friend. But Gilbert suddenly raised his head. And you, your majesty. The Foreign Affairs Minister's voice suddenly rose. Many people were taken aback by this. Gilbert stared straight into the king's eyes, which were filled with pressure. His chest rose and fell. Forgive me for overstepping my authority, but... Gilbert raised his right arm as if he wanted to point at something, but he gave up halfway. He gritted his teeth. His face was conflicted. But until today, all the unfair scrutiny, accusations, criticism, and difficulties His Highness has received since he returned to Constellation, in Eternal Star City, and even at this table. In the face of King Kessel's sharp gaze, Gilbert made up his mind and spoke through gritted teeth. He said through gritted teeth, "It is all because of your attitude towards him." As soon as he said this, the expressions of all the officials before the king changed. Gilbert. Guy warned sternly. Prime Minister Cullen's face was tense as he sank into deep thought. But the king only stared back at Gilbert quietly and did not say a word. Only Gilbert gulped, closed his eyes and sighed. To be honest, Your Majesty, I am not very competent as a subject or as a father. I have no right to lecture you. But as a friend. Gilbert opened his eyes. He was sincere and serious. Kai, Your Highness, Fifth Prince. These titles made everyone's thoughts stir. King Kessel did not speak. But at that moment, his fingers that were tapping on the table stopped. You really should be proud and gratified that you have such a son. You should be proud and gratified by his awareness and ability, his character and intelligence, his strength and optimism, and the fact that he didn't collapse under the heavy burden of the entire kingdom. Gilbert stared at him from afar. I believe, and I am not the only one. We all believe from the bottom of our hearts. Prince Thales will be the future that we all look forward to. At that moment, no one in the Imperial Conference spoke. The silence lasted for a whole 10 seconds. You give him lessons every day, Gilbert. The king's deep voice traveled, and his emotions could not be discerned. You are too close to him. Gilbert was stunned for a moment before he smiled. No, you are the one who is too far away from him. Just like the late king. At that moment, the Iron Hand King's eyes suddenly moved. It was like the first crack on a flawless iron wall. But at that time you still had Mindy's hole. Gilbert looked at the throne quietly, but he seemed to be looking at something else. And now, he has nothing. King Kessel seemed to be fixed in his chair. Even his gaze did not move. Get close to him, Your Majesty. At least try to get close to him. At least talk to him. Gilbert took a deep breath and sat down shakily. He pressed against his eyes and flashed an ashamed smile at the people around him. My apologies, everyone. Ballard Room seemed to have sunk into an ice cellar. The king and his ministers were all silent. They either lowered their heads in silence or looked at each other. Only the sound of breathing remained. After a long time, everyone trembled slightly. King Kessel's voice was like the first ray of sunlight that broke through the ice and broke the silence. Don't worry about my son. I have already talked to him. At the end of the long table, the Iron Hand King slowly raised his head, but he did not look at anyone. He will not be a problem. He closed his eyes and exhaled softly. Everything is under control. His voice faded away. Prime Minister Cullen curled his lips. Gilbert forced a smile onto his face. The others had different reactions. They were all worried. Duke Cullen picked up his teacup, sat up straight, and performed his duty. All right, everyone. Now, back to what we were. But the Prime Minister's words came to an abrupt halt. Everyone looked over in confusion. Only then did they realize that Cullen's expression had changed. The Duke of Eastern Sea was staring intently at the teacup in his hand. There were tiny ripples on the surface of the teacup. Almost at the same time, the ministers in Ballard Room sensed something amiss and turned around. Asterisk thud. 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 Asterisk the sound of footsteps in groups came from outside the room, causing an obvious tremor. This was a rare occurrence. The ministers looked at each other, not understanding what was going on. These footsteps, there are at least 30 people. As a military advisor who had served for many years, Sauter looked up warily. What happened? But no one answered him. On the contrary, different orders were faintly heard through the crack in the door. Vanguard Division, gather reinforcements. Run, run, run. The situation is unclear. Guard Division deploy on the spot. Something was not right. The ministers were alarmed and uncertain. The king also frowned. Strange. Gilbert frowned. Is the Royal Guards having a drill today? Near Ballard Room? The next second, a rapid and ear-piercing ring of a bell penetrated the wall and rang in everyone's ears. Ding! Many people were startled and looked around in panic. This is the Royal Guards. Advisor Sauter was stunned. He blinked and stared at the dark stone door, unable to believe his own deduction. An emergency alarm? The king remained calm, but his frown deepened. The scar-faced spy from the Secret Intelligence Department was the first to move. He reached for the door. But before he could touch the doorknob, the door to Ballard Room was flung open. Chapter 6:15. Your Majesty, gentlemen. The head guard of the Royal Guards, Lord Fabio Adrian, carried an everlasting lamp and walked through the door in a dignified manner. A few well-trained Royal Guards followed behind him. Forgive me for interrupting, but it's time for dinner. Although they were acquaintances, the sight of them fully armed and ready for battle still gave everyone a fright. Fabio, you look good. Duke Cullen touched his belt and shifted his but without batting an eyelid. His eyes never leaving the sword at Captain Adrian's waist. Just to call us for dinner? Thank you. Adrian flashed a friendly smile and bowed deeply to King Kessel. Please do not panic. We are just doing a small drill. Now, please follow me out of here in an orderly manner. But an impatient voice interrupted him. Fabio, what's going on? Advisor Sauter frowned as he looked at the Royal Guards and the increasing number of guards outside, paying particular attention to their hands on the hilts of their swords. Why are there so many people in this guard formation? Lord Adrian smiled. He first glanced at the king at the end of the long table, then said politely, It's nothing. Sir Sauter, we brought forward the drill this month, that's all. But Sauter did not buy it. That's enough, Fabio. The military advisor snorted coldly. We served in the regular army together and experienced the bloody year together. You and I both know that this is not some bullshit routine drill. You are facing the entire Imperial Conference, and everyone here is an elite of the kingdom. What is there that you can't say? This sentence made many of the ministers, who had no military experience, nervous. As they spoke, the commotion outside Ballard did not stop, but grew louder and louder. Shouts and hurried footsteps could be heard from time to time. Captain Adrian looked at Sauter solemnly and sighed deeply. He glanced at the king again, hesitating to speak. At the end of the table, King Kessel was as calm as ever. He crooked his finger and gestured for Adrian to come closer. Lord Adrian. Gilbert could see some clues, and he spoke gently. If there is any inconvenience, of course we can cooperate. We are hungry anyway, aren't we? But just as Adrian approached the table, the footsteps outside the door suddenly grew louder, almost deafening. What followed was the sound of weapons being unsheathed. They're here. Guard Division, hold steady. Who the F***CK called the sniper team over? Protect His Majesty. Back off. The shouts of the Royal Guards rose and fell one after another. They were all different, but it made Lord Adrian's face turn pale. The captain of the Royal Guards turned around and protected King Kessel behind him. Sauter immediately reacted. He instinctively reached for his waist, only to remember that he had left his weapon at the palace gate. Only then did the officials in the room realize that something was wrong. Duke Cullen sprang up nimbly from his chair and drew a small dagger from his belt. Gilbert grabbed his staff and rushed towards the king. Cuckold disappeared with a whoosh, leaving only his but exposed under the table. Viscount Kenny was the first to rush to the door, but he remembered something and quickly returned to approach the king. Lord Croppen's face was ashen, but he forced himself to remain calm. Archdeacon Guy closed his eyes and muttered something. Enough! Lord Adrian's angry roar shocked everyone. Following his order, the chaos outside the door was the first to stop. In Ballard Room, 3 crisp thuds came from the conference table and drifted away. Thud. 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 Hold steady. King Kessel retracted his fingers and calmly looked at the officials who had different reactions. It's not like I haven't seen it before. He remained seated behind the conference table, seemingly unaffected. The officials who had overreacted finally reacted. They were either embarrassed as they hurriedly tidied themselves up. Gilbert exhaled and sat back in his seat. Prime Minister Cullen nonchalantly tucked the dagger that should not have been there back into his belt. Sodder, on the other hand, bent down disdainfully and lifted Kirkle out from under the table. Everyone returned to their proper appearance. They then realized that the originally spacious door of Ballard Room had been completely blocked by the wall of royal guards. They could not see the scene outside at all. Every guard was facing the door, leaving only their backs to the officials in the room. The officials looked at each other, confused. Why, is there an assassin? Sodder asked in confusion. Adrian. King Kessel spoke again, with dissatisfaction and questioning in his voice. The captain of the royal guards responded with an apologetic and ashamed smile. Sir. At the same time, a high-ranking royal guard parted the wall of guards and squeezed into the room in exasperation. Captain Adrian. Adrian's expression darkened as he called out his subordinate's name. Mariko. The second vanguard of the royal guards, Mariko held down his weapon and shook his head regretfully before bowing to the other important people. Your Majesty, my lords. Adrian sighed bitterly as he understood what he meant. What's going on outside the door? The king's voice rang steadily, voicing everyone's thoughts. Get them out of the way, don't block it. Adrian turned around, bowed, and forced a smile. Your Majesty, this is just a routine measure, we only need 1 minute. Unexpectedly, King Kessel, who had been calm all day, suddenly raised his voice and shouted angrily at the wall of people at the door. Royal guards, get out of the way. The guards could not be more familiar with the king's voice. The guards guarding the door instinctively retreated to the left and right, revealing the first row of guards, then the next row, then the next row, and the next row, until they revealed the deep corridor outside the door that was dotted with lights. Everyone was stunned the moment they saw the corridor outside the door. Only the king remained calm, and his gaze was cold. Adrian could not stop him in time. He could only sigh. Outside the door, the royal guards were densely packed and ready for battle. With Ballard Room as the center, they filled all the spots in the corridor where people could stand. All the guards had solemn expressions as they faced the depths of the corridor warily and nervously. It was as if the most terrifying enemy was there. The noisy Renaissance palace fell silent at this moment. Asterisk thud. 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 Asterisk. A strange but clear sound came from the depths of the corridor, from the end of the line of sight. The people in Ballard Room widened their eyes. A tall horse stepped on the stone slabs in Renaissance Palace. While facing the countless guards and lights around it, it slowly walked over from the corridor. The royal guards at the front were under the most pressure. They held the hilts of their swords tightly, but kept retreating as the horse approached. What's going on? Lord Croppen was in disbelief, but he immediately shut his mouth. Because around the black horse, a few people who were clearly dressed differently from the royal guards gradually appeared in front of everyone. It was a small group of people. They nervously surrounded the horse and moved forward with trepidation. I don't want to say this, but I recognize that big guy. Sodder looked at the tall man leading the group with a headache. The latter was sweating profusely as he looked at the royal guards around him and raised his hands. It's the boy from the Caribbean family. His father sent him to the army for training. He seems to have made some contributions. I even praised him when I went to the Western Desert to work in the army. Caribbean? Everyone was stunned. Damn it, that's the youngest son of the Glover family. Jolene narrowed her eyes and looked at the companion beside the tall man who was even stronger than the former. Lozano asked me to do him a favor and help his younger brother solve the problem of jealousy in Red Street Market. Lin Yun said. Glover. This surname increased everyone's suspicion. Ah! Duke Cullen's voice rose in a thought-provoking manner. His gaze focused on another person who was panting and limping. That unlucky guy who got into a duel last night, from the Doyle family. What's his name again? I think it's Danny? David. Doyle. Everyone's mood became more and more solemn. The small group of people was getting closer and closer to Ballard Room, but the royal guards in front of them did not stop them. They just kept retreating. If that's the case, that horse I remember now. Viscount Kenny's gaze was focused on the beast and he said in confusion, "When I went to Northland, I brought along a gift and a mount from my country for Prince Thales." Among the ministers, Gilbert did not say a word. He just stared blankly at the young swordsman at the front, who was holding a single-edged sword and facing the royal guards with a nervous expression. It was as if he was hit by something. However, these invaders of extraordinary origins were nothing. When their figures dispersed and revealed the person they were escorting, the air completely froze. It was a teenager. Compared to the nervous expressions of the people around him, he strolled forward leisurely, as if he was not worried at all. At that moment, behind the meeting table, King Kessel's pupils suddenly constricted. And in Ballard Room, all the ministers sucked in a cold breath. Prince! What the hell? The Duke of Star Lake. Prince Thales. The troublemaker is in trouble again. May the setting sun protect him. No one noticed that the scar-faced detective from the Secret Intelligence Department clenched his fists tightly under his sleeves. The king's voice rang faintly. Fabio Adrian. The Iron Hand King slowly called out the full name of his personal guard captain, as if it was chilling to the bone. What happened? In Ballard Room, the ministers immediately quieted down. Lord Adrian's body stiffened. Then, he turned around and responded with a salute. His words were formal. Your Majesty, Prince Thales missed his father dearly and came back carelessly. Looking at the tall horse approaching, Adrian's eyebrows twitched. Speak human language. The king's reply was simple, slow, and strange. Adrian took a deep breath and continued. The prince is still young and accidentally entered the palace gate. Asterisk thud. Asterisk a soft knock cut off Adrian's words. Obviously, the Iron Hand King's voice was very soft, as if he was speaking quietly with his breath, gentle and indifferent. Your commanding officer does not know how to speak human language, Mariko. The second vanguard. Mariko trembled slightly. Adrian closed his eyes and sighed, but this could not stop the king's request. You answer. Within 2 seconds, Mariko's chest rose and fell. He glanced at his commanding officer and gritted his teeth. Your Majesty, from what I saw. Mariko took a step forward and pointed angrily at the corridor. The Duke of Star Lake and his entourage of 8 trespassed the palace grounds with weapons without an appointment or notification. Their intentions. Unknown. Everyone was shocked. Duke Cullen dug his ears desperately, as if suspecting that he had heard wrongly. Gilbert stared at Thales in disbelief, his lips moving. At first, the air in Ballard Room was only stagnant, but after these words, it turned cold. At the end of the long table, King Kessel's pupils reflected the slowly approaching Thales. He snorted nonchalantly in response. And you let him in just like that? Mariko frowned and was about to respond, but Adrian beat him to it. Your Majesty, the guards on duty at the palace gate today are not good with words and are rigid in their actions. They had a conflict with His Highness men. There was some verbal friction and some pushing. But the king's voice rang again. Mariko? The second vanguard gulped and glanced at his commanding officer again. Adrian looked at him, troubled. In the end, Mariko no longer hesitated and said indignantly, Your Majesty, just now, Duke Thales tried to force his way into the palace. The guards at the gate were loyal to their duties and refused to let him in, so they fought with the Duke's men. There was blood on both sides. Since you are loyal to your duties, King Kessel interrupted him mercilessly. His tone was flat, but inexplicably frightening. Then how did he get in? Mariko shuddered and immediately lowered his head, unable to hide his shame. The vassals' gazes moved back and forth between the slowly approaching Thales and Mariko, and finally returned to the king. Mariko! Adrian reminded him softly by the side. But Kessel glanced at him and cut off Adrian's words. Mariko took a deep breath and gritted his teeth. After the blood, things became strange. Many people quickly gathered at the palace gate to watch, and the scene was very big. Adrian coughed and continued Danger's line of thought. I was the one who made the decision. We had to let His Highness in and deal with this matter in the palace, or else the entire Eternal Star City would have seen that scene. For the sake of the kingdom. Asterisk bang. Asterisk there was a loud sound, but it was the king who slammed his fist on the table. What followed was his extremely cold and angry rebuke. Is there no one who saw it now? Once he said this, Adrian and Mariko bowed together and knelt down on one knee. The vassals in the room did not even dare to breathe loudly. At that moment, "Father!" The unique voice of a young man came from afar. "Why are you angry?" The vassals turned their heads in unison. At some point, Thales had already walked to a distance where they could see his movements clearly. In this tense moment, the prince's voice had a hint of laziness and ease. The strange thing was that the prince was actually carrying a sword on his shoulder. The blade of the sword was pointed backwards, and as he walked, it swayed and swayed, pointing straight at the ceiling of Renaissance Palace. King Kessel frowned. "Mariko, what happened?" The second vanguard, who knew his mistake, was shocked and did not know how to answer. Adrian, who was beside him, immediately understood. He knew what the king was asking, and he answered respectfully. "After entering the palace, we were about to capture him, but His Highness immediately put the sword to his own neck. He used so much force that it even drew blood." The vassals were shocked. They focused their gazes, and only then did they realize that there were traces of unusual red on Thales' collar. He walked forward step by step, and his sword never left his neck. "We did not dare to act rashly. To prevent accidents, we could only retreat." After listening to the royal guard's explanation, Duke Cullen's gaze on Thales became more and more interesting, while Gilbert became more and more worried. Compared to his previous rage, King Kessel did not immediately reply. He leaned his back against the chair again, and his brows were tightly furrowed. "So, these are my royal guards." The king exhaled. His tone returned to its previous calmness, but there was a hint of mockery in it. "Now, I finally know how my father died." Everyone's breathing froze. These words were extremely heavy. Lord Adrian could only lower his head, close his eyes, sigh, and apologize. On the other side, the younger Mariko gritted his teeth and said indignantly, "Your Majesty, please let us." But Thales' words came again, interrupting everyone's thoughts. "Father!" Everyone looked over. The Duke of Star Lake and his attendants had stopped at some point in time, and they stopped in front of a row of guards who would rather die than retreat. The prince laboriously shifted the heavy sword to his other shoulder, causing the royal guards around him to feel nervous. But he did not look at the people in Ballard Room. He only scrutinized the portrait near him. Sand King Kessel IV was fully armed and riding on a horse. He raised his head and looked into the distance. His gaze was firm, his posture was straight, and he looked heroic. But Thales knew that a century ago, the direction the Sand King in the portrait ran to was a war that was destined to be lost. "The meeting has been going on for so long. Aren't you tired?" Thales shifted his gaze back to Ballard Room. He activated his hell senses, allowing him to see King Kessel clearly under the lights and the setting sun. He ignored the royal guards who had terrifying gazes around him, smiled slightly, and raised his voice. "Shall we talk?" In Ballard Room, everyone's gazes returned to King Kessel. Behind the meeting table, the Iron Hand King stared coldly at his son. After a while he spoke. "Let him in." Mariko quickly turned around. "Your Majesty?" King Kessel sneered. "I said let him in." Adrian shook his head at Mariko, then ordered the royal guards inside and outside the room. On the invader's side, the prince's attendant, Wuxia, gulped when he saw a gap in the royal guard's defense line. "Your Highness." Thales exhaled. "All of you stay." The prince bared his teeth as he felt the soreness in his shoulders and the cut on his neck. "Cooperate with us later. Don't resist." Cohen, who was in charge of clearing the path, was stunned. His face was pale from fear. "Huh!" Ralph, who was at the back of the formation, also turned around. His gaze was displeased. "Don't worry, all of you are my subordinates, they probably won't." Thales paused for a moment and swallowed the second half of his sentence. "Won't beat them up too harshly? After all, this is a rebellion." Around them, the densely packed royal guards were still nervous, as if they were facing a great enemy. Beside Thales, Jenny, the black horse, felt the terrible atmosphere and neighed uneasily. "I know it's too dark here. You don't like it, right?" Thales turned around and comforted Jenny quietly. "It's okay." "Me too." Jenny whimpered and quieted down, feeling wronged. The Duke of Star Lake stopped smiling. He carried the incredibly heavy long sword and strode forward. Just like countless times in the past, he walked forward alone. The prince's sudden approaching figure made the royal guards around him spread out abruptly. Like a whistling arrow shooting into the forest, it startled countless birds. Thales could feel that when he crossed the threshold and brushed past the royal guards, the vanguard named Mariko stared at the long sword on his neck. His muscles twitched rhythmically, as if he was waiting for an opportunity to attack. But Adrian, who was beside him, held him down firmly. Finally, Thales stepped through the door of Ballard Room unscathed and saw King Kessel behind the meeting table. This journey was really not easy. The prince stopped in front of the meeting table and seemed to be in high spirits. You are well protected, father. Even your own son had to shed blood to meet you. King Kessel only stared at him coldly. There was not even a hint of obvious expression on his face. It was just as Thales expected. Unlike before, the prince did not pay attention to the king. He looked around with interest. In front of him, the ministers of the imperial conference stared at him with dumbfounded expressions. Their expressions were interesting. Behind him, countless royal guards glared at him resentfully and gritted their teeth. As expected, Anchor was right. Without waiting for the others to react, Thales sighed and tightened his grip on the sword beside his neck. He lamented to himself. That's right. He sighed and lamented. If I don't kill, no one will listen. Even if it's my own life. He narrowed his eyes and looked back at King Kessel. Similarly, if I don't rebel, the tyrant will be fearless. He might even think that he is very popular. What kind of world is this? Your Highness. In the Imperial Conference, Gilbert was the first to be unable to hold back. He tried his best to hide his anxiety and forced a smile. What are you doing? Thales turned his head, and his eyes lit up. Gilbert, how are you? The prince's tone was very bright. There was no hint of gloominess, and it was a stark contrast to the atmosphere in Renaissance Palace. By the way, Wire is back. Thales flashed his thumb behind him. He did not care whether his thumb was correct or not. He just chuckled. A reunion between father and son. How touching. For some reason, Thales, who had been filled with pressure when he entered and left Renaissance Palace a few times, actually felt relaxed and happy at that moment. It was as if he had removed all his burdens. But his smile did not last long. Because at that moment, Gilbert's expression was extremely complicated. He stared at Thales' face, then at the sword on his shoulder. He seemed to be smiling bitterly, grieving, sighing, and feeling grief. It made Thales stunned for a moment. I know, Your Highness. Gilbert sucked in a deep breath and lowered his head. When he looked up again, he was beaming with joy. You are not satisfied with your marriage. Gilbert's smile froze, and he suppressed his rapid breathing. I understand. When he said this, many people were confused. Thales was also stunned. Marriage? What marriage? But you don't have to be so anxious. Gilbert cut him off fiercely. While he talked to himself, he gave Thales an anxious look. I told you. Just wait for me at the entrance of the palace. I will explain it to you. Gilbert laughed, turned his head and smiled bitterly at the others. You know, young people are not satisfied with their marriage candidates. They are a little impulsive and wanted to clarify things with me. And our meeting went on for too long. He could not stay, so Thales blinked and gradually understood. He could not help but feel warmth in his heart. But it was a pity. Gilbert. I see. Deputy Bishop Guy reacted quickly. He smiled faintly and nodded. Marriage is indeed a big matter. May the goddess bless. Viscount Kenny was born noble. He also reacted and laughed heartily. Oh yes. Of course, we were young once, we understand. Prime Minister Cullen also blinked and shook his head like a kind and amiable old man. I still remember that His Majesty once made a fuss about marriage in front of the late king. The ministers in the Imperial Conference laughed continuously. They had excellent chemistry and soon got along well, making the atmosphere in Ballard Room much more comfortable. Most of the royal guards also understood what was going on. Unknowingly, they began to laugh and relax their tense muscles. But Adrian sadly noticed that in the face of such an atmosphere, only two people were unmoved. King Kessel did not laugh. He stared blankly at Thales, as if there was no one else in his eyes at that moment. Thales put on a fake smile. There was no warmth in his eyes when he looked back at the king, only an eager challenge. Fabio, very good. You are very responsible. It was just a false alarm. Advisor Sauter exhaled and gave Adrian a thumbs up. But the exercise was very effective. I suggest that we reward our brothers. Clang! A muffled sound of metal colliding suddenly rang out. The royal guards who had not completely relaxed shuddered and unsheathed their swords. Steady! Adrian bellowed, calming down a possible conflict. The royal guards who had just come to their senses breathed rapidly and looked at each other nervously. Only then did they put away their weapons under the strict orders of their commanding officer. The ministers in front of the Imperial Conference were tongue-tied in disbelief. Sorry, it's too heavy. The person responsible for the muffled sound, Thales, breathed heavily. He laughed and dragged the blade from the ground. No wonder it's called load-bearer. King Kessel narrowed his eyes. The emotions in his eyes became more and more indescribable. After this incident, the minister's efforts were completely interrupted. Gilbert's expression only became more bitter. This made Thales feel a little guilty. But soon, he put this behind him. He stepped forward nonchalantly and reached out his hand. Swoosh! A few of the royal guards unsheathed their weapons again. Don't worry. This time, Thales chuckled and walked to the discussion table. He gestured for everyone to relax. I just want to give myself. The prince sat down casually, patted the shoulder of the person next to him, and looked into the Iron Hand King's eyes. Find a chair. Near him, Chief of Finance Kirk looked at the prince's hand patting his shoulder and revealed a smile that was uglier than crying. Sensing the puzzled and uneasy gazes around him, Thales smiled. Yes. Be it in the Hall of Heroes or here. He had to find a chair for himself. He had to wield a heavy sword that was beyond his means. He bet his life. Thales stared at King Kessel. He suddenly realized that every time he looked into his father's eyes, he could feel the heaviness and pressure. Gone. Even though the king's gaze was still sharp, he still felt a slight sting when he looked into it. Sorry to disturb you, everyone. Thales slapped his thigh and leaned against the discussion table. He smiled and said, I'm afraid that today's Imperial Conference will end early. In Ballard Room, both the courtiers and the guards looked at each other, not knowing what to do. The king's gaze became more profound. Thales looked at the sky outside the window and could not help but smile. Perhaps it's not too early? He suddenly had a feeling that on the small table in front of him, there were surging waves that were constantly moving, pulling back and forth lines that were drawn back and forth. At this moment, he stepped into this room, just like a ship parting the water, cutting the Gordian knot. Finally. What are you doing? King Kessel's voice rang in the silence. He enunciated his words slowly, very slowly. Son. Son. When he heard this title, Thales felt a little dazed. Me. Thales paused and showed a sincere smile. I'm here to save you. The prince's inexplicable answer made everyone frown. In front of everyone, the Iron Hand King let out a faint laugh. Save me? He leaned back and blended into the darkness where the sunlight could not reach. He became indifferent again. It was as if his anger and madness had reached its peak, and he had returned to extreme calmness. Yes, father. Thales' attitude was relaxed and cheerful, as if he was enjoying a conversation between father and son. I'm here to save you. The prince also leaned back and entered the warm embrace of the setting sun. Only his gaze suddenly turned cold. It was like a sharp blade being unsheathed. To be free from the burden of that crown. Thales curled his lips and looked at the Iron Hand King with a smile. The crown. When he said this, the faces of the ministers in front of the emperor immediately turned ashen. The royal guards were all stunned. Gilbert could not hide his panic. He lost his composure and shouted, Your Highness! At that moment, the light in King Kessel's eyes changed back and forth. But in the end, it all came to one. It was directed at the Duke of Star Lake's smile. Thales raised his eyebrows and his smile froze. Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot. While countless people lost their composure in fear, Thales reacted and pointed at King Kessel's forehead without a crown. He smiled apologetically. It's not on your head. Chapter 6:16. Other than the indistinct sound of breathing, Ballard Room was so quiet that a pin drop could be heard. But as the chief commander of the royal guards, Lord Adrian felt that this was one of the most torturous, and painful moments of his life. Flames flickered and the shadows of the blades swayed. The setting sun illuminated the wall, blood red. Separated by a table, the Supreme King and the Duke of Star Lake faced each other in silence. Everyone else went silent like cicadas in the winter. Amidst their fear and nervousness, they waited for this strange and fragile silence. Finally, after an unknown amount of time, King Kessel's deep and forbearing voice slowly rang in the room. Why? Why? The king's words were calm and slow, but contained an unbearable weight. The young duke's low laughter responded to him. Thales rested his forehead on the hilt of the load-bearing sword, exhaled, and stopped laughing. Shouldn't you have expected this to happen? After you summoned me to the palace to have an audience with you, and after you raided Mindy's hall? Thales raised his head, his eyes like lightning. Your Majesty? The prince's reply was light and indifferent, but it made many people who had been tense for a long time inexplicably heave a sigh of relief. The king stared at his son, the blue ocean in his eyes regaining its incomprehensible depth. He did not think for long before he snorted and turned his head, as if the person in the seat opposite him was not worthy of his attention. Adrian. Mariko. The chief guard captain and the second vanguard bowed and pressed their hands on their chests. Your Majesty? Your Majesty! King Kessel picked up the letter on the table and began to read. The Duke of Star Lake is overtired and mentally unstable. The king's casual words instantly made everyone's expressions change. Even Thales frowned slightly. Let the royal guards escort him back to Mindy's hall to recuperate. Keep a low profile. The Imperial Conference continues. Mariko gladly accepted the order, and before he could wave his hand, one or two of the more daring and disgruntled guards had already stepped forward. Gilbert's face turned pale with fright. Your Majesty! No. Even Prime Minister Cullen frowned. Your Majesty, will you reconsider? The people from Mindy's hall outside the door were just as anxious, but Waya and Ralph, who were the first to move, already had a few swords pressed against their necks. Glover was pinned to the ground by a few of his comrades from the Vanguard Division, and he could not even breathe. Doyle, who was yelling loudly, had his mouth and nose covered. He could only shout, No! The battle-hardened Cohen used the Black Horse as a barrier and struggled back and forth, causing the royal guards to panic. But at some point, a scar-faced man from Ballard Room appeared behind him. He said something, but the ferocious man suddenly froze. Then the scar-faced man struck the back of Cohen's head, causing him to fall to the ground. The restless Jenny bared her teeth fiercely, but an experienced old guard lit a burning torch and pressed it in front of her. The big black horse whimpered and immediately became obedient to protect itself. Thales looked away from the corner of his eye. He knew that he had no backup, even though they were muddle-headed when they entered the palace. But Your Majesty! Adrian, the captain of the guards, raised his hand to placate Mariko, who was about to make a move, and said tentatively, From here to Mindy's hall, Fabio Adrian. The king was so absorbed in reading the letter that he did not even raise his head. When his full name was called, Lord Adrian immediately lowered his head and shut his mouth. I've been lenient enough today. No matter who it is. Even though he was speaking to the captain of the guards, everyone present, including Gilbert, the vassals, and the gods felt their hearts tremble. Don't test my patience. At this moment, dang! A sharp sound rose, and the group was shocked. They turned their heads around simultaneously. Thales held the hilt upside down and smashed the tip of the load-bearer against the floor tiles of Ballard Room to check the quality of the ancient Empire sword. Clang, clang, clang. In front of everyone, Thales ignored the gasps. With the help of the Sin of Hell's River, he lifted the load-bearing person onto his shoulders and clicked his tongue in amazement. The guards closest to the youth were about to step forward, but when they saw this scene, they couldn't help but stop. Bearers. As expected of the blockhead's family heirloom sword. Not only was its quality up to standard, it was also very heavy. Just maintaining this posture without collapsing had used up a lot of his strength. Not to mention, he also had to prevent the blade from accidentally injuring him when it was right in front of him. It was just like his title. I keep thinking that this room is too monotonous. Feeling the cold blade on his shoulders, the prince raised his head and faced the tense people with a cheerful attitude. Maybe I should hang one more painting, such as... Thales narrowed his eyes, and his tone instantly became serious. Ascension King's sacrifice? At that moment, many people could not help but hold their breaths. Thales saw their reactions and smiled coldly. He became even more unruly and unruly. Or the Iron Hand King kills his son? Kills his son. The group was first stunned. Then they looked at the king nervously. Stop fooling around, Your Highness. Seeing that the situation was getting worse, Gilbert spoke sternly. He had always been polite to the prince, and his face was filled with pain. He called Thales by his name. Thales. But Thales only returned him a smile and said nothing. Only the setting sun shone on his collar, casting a bright red hue. Faced with the prince's response, Lord Adrian sighed helplessly and looked at the king again. At the end of the long table, the Iron Hand King seemed to come back to his senses and slowly looked up from the letter. This is the kingdom's imperial conference. He glanced sideways at his son and snorted without a care. I don't have time to listen to an aggrieved brat cry his heart out. The vassals looked at each other. King Kessel's tone suddenly turned cold. If he wants to commit suicide, let him be. Let him be. In the midst of his shock, Thales could not help but clench his teeth. Jadestar does not need idiots. The Iron Hand King lowered his head and returned his gaze to the letter. Or cowards. Everyone's gaze returned to the Duke of Star Lake. The vassals nervously paid attention to his gaze and words, while the guards stared at his movements and the tip of his sword. Thales felt a chill in his heart. At that moment, it was as if he had returned to Dragoncloud City and the Hall of Heroes in Heroic Spirit Palace 6 years ago. At that time, the born king and the 5 archdukes' gazes were the same as now. Like thousands of sharp arrows, they shot towards the sword in his hand that was too heavy to hold. They were waiting. Waiting for him to commit suicide. Or surrender. It had been 6 years. Nothing had changed. Except for one thing. Thales' gaze became determined. The sin of Hell's river gathered like a trickle, helping him to grip the bearer on his shoulder. The sword in his hand was no longer unbearably heavy. Then you must be an idiot and a coward, father? Thales spoke calmly, but his words were as sharp as a knife. Or you don't want to be a Jadestar again? Is that so? As soon as he finished speaking, the content insulting the king was met with a dead silence before it caused an uproar. The king did not move. Only his eyes emitted a cold light. It had been 18 years since Kessel Jadestar was crowned king after the Bloody Year. During the era of the Iron Hand King's rule, the last time someone directly contradicted or even insulted the Supreme King was during the National Conference 6 years ago. The Duke who committed treason and spoke rudely was already in prison. He was destined to spend the rest of his life behind bars. Many people who hoped that the situation would calm down had their hopes dashed. They could not help but sigh in pain. The royal guards' gazes were solemn. They pressed on their weapons and nodded to each other as a final confirmation. Your Highness. Gilbert's face was ashen. He closed his eyes and did not speak any more. But unexpectedly, the king moved slightly and put down the letter. Oh! King Kessel's questioning voice rose, stopping a few guards who were prepared to launch a sneak attack from behind. The king stared at the prince for a very, very long time. But this time, there was something else in Kessel's gaze. Why? Thales gripped the load-bearer tightly and sat up straight again. He faced his opponent. King Kessel snorted coldly and reacted just as quickly. Are you so sure that I do not dare? Of course you dare. The prince replied sternly. You can kill me here, secretly send my corpse out of the palace, then announce that Prince Thales died of an acute illness and passed away in Mindy's Hall, just like the former Fog King Mindy's the First. Fog King. No. Gilbert realized the worst outcome, and his face turned pale. The Iron Hand King's gaze was as sharp as a knife, piercing straight at Thales. But Thales did not wait for the other to reply and stood up with a bang. But the premise is... Amidst the sounds of unsheathing and shouts, the prince held his sword with one hand and pressed the other against the table. He shouted angrily, everyone who witnessed the king killing his son, be it the ministers or the guards, must keep their mouths sealed for years, decades, or even a lifetime. Even if you have to kill them. At that moment, Viscount Kenny, Lord Croppen, Advisor Sauter. The ministers looked at each other in disbelief. Ah! Chief Kirkirk reacted quickly. He pressed a hand to his eyes and said with a trembling voice, I am only here for a meeting. I didn't see anything today. But before he could finish, Duke Cullen stopped the chief of finance like a lion. "Shut up, Kirkuk." The chief of finance was about to say something when Sauter swiftly pulled him to his side and sealed his mouth. Lord Adrian hurriedly made hand gestures, trying his best to appease the defense line that was on the verge of losing control due to the sudden turn of events. The atmosphere was extremely tense. "That's the only way." But Thales did not care about anything else. He only stared at the king in front of him, gritted his teeth and panted. "You won't leak the news, repeat the evil example of the Ascension King's son, endanger the authority of the royal family, and threaten your rule." But he had obviously miscalculated. The Ascension King? Evil example? On the throne, King Kessel laughed angrily. "If we can recreate Alan I's greatness, why not sacrifice a prince?" As soon as these words came out, the ministers and guards were shocked again. Thales frowned hard and gritted his teeth. No one knew that his shoulder was starting to go numb from the pressure of Cohen's Duanmu sword. The sin of Hell's river surged into his veins, soothing his pain, but tightening his nerves. Compared to his many enemies, King Nuvan, King Chapman, Zayn, Fakenhaz, Asda, Giza, the ugly-faced woman, Stake, the Iron Hand King might not be the strongest, the strangest, or the scariest. But he was definitely the toughest. Impervious to the slightest threat. Fearless of the worst outcome. Not hesitant to perish together. Compared to him, Roman Williams, with his skull on his shoulders, was simply the most gentle, considerate, and easygoing person in the world. "Your Highness! Your Majesty!" Seeing that the situation was spiraling out of control, the host of the Imperial Conference, Prime Minister Cullen, had to speak up to ease the situation. "We are both Jade Stars, and we are father and son." The old Duke sighed. At this moment, he spoke earnestly. "Is there a need for this? We are both Jade Stars. We are both father and son." These words made Thales clench his fists and size up the Iron Hand King's sharp face again. But at the same time, what echoed in his ears was the desolate question of the traitor Sam'el in the prison of bones. Is it a son killing his father, or a brother killing his brother? A son killing his father. The sin of Hell's river began to roar like a fierce beast, tearing at the cage that trapped him. Thales stared at the Iron Hand King's neck expressionlessly. He could not help but think of the night of dragon's blood, when the born king's head fell to the ground. Reality told him that the king's head was nothing special. Like an ordinary person, it would make a sound, roll, and bleed when it fell to the ground. Like a hollow, rotten watermelon. Thales tightened his grip on the hilt of his sword again. "Stay in your seat, Bob," Kessel said coldly, rejecting the Prime Minister. "Since it's a family matter, outsiders have no right to butt in." These words were blunt, vulgar, and merciless. The senior and respected Cullen's expression immediately turned sour. No one else dared to interrupt. Family matter. Thales snorted and tried hard to get rid of it. "Yes, such as domestic violence." Thales lowered his voice and said coldly, "If you don't kill, no one will listen." Perhaps because his tone was completely different this time, the king's gaze paused. On the other side, Advisor Sauter thought of something and could not help but sigh. "You remind me of His Highness Horace, Duke Thales." Lord Adrian frowned. For the first time, he put his hands behind his back and gave a secret order to the guards. "Horace? Horace?" The king sneered. "He's still a long way off." The next moment, Kessel V did not give him a chance. "The farce is over, child. You have 10 seconds to put down your weapon." The Iron Hand King's smile faded and he raised his hand coldly at the royal guards. "Or your head will fall to the ground." The sin of Hell's river boiled restlessly. Hell's senses were activated naturally, allowing Thales to hear the shuffling of footsteps and clothes as countless guards quietly surrounded him. "Put down your weapon, or your head will fall to the ground." 10 seconds. All of this. In exchange for his 10 seconds. The sin of Hell's river surged uncontrollably. Thales stared hard into King Kessel's eyes and resisted the urge to leap up and swing his sword. He knew that King Kessel was serious. But it was a pity. So was he. "I know, father." Thales' expression was grim and his tone was cold, just like his opponent. "You disdain compromise and never show weakness. You still want to solve the problem as resolutely and decisively as before." Thales knocked on the spine of the load-bearer's sword and was greeted with a dull metallic sound. But in the end, you're not doing this willingly. The young man forgot the different looks of the courtiers, forgot the footsteps of the guards following the king's gesture, and even forgot the heavy sword on his neck. He only had eyes for the end of the long table, for the opponent he could not choose and could only face. The sin of hell's river kept surging. You don't want to lose the entire game because of one chess piece. Thales looked deeply at King Kessel and moved the blade in his hand an inch closer to his neck. The entire game? The Iron Hand King sneered. 10 seconds are up, and you're not as important as you think, child. Then the same goes for you, father. Unexpectedly, Thales shouted. He held the hilt of the sword with both hands and placed the blade horizontally in front of his throat. The sin of hell's river surged wildly. Compared to a kingdom of 680 years and an empire of 2,000 years, you and I are nothing. Thales glared angrily. His abdomen pressed against the table and his body leaned forward to the limit. The heavy sword on his shoulder trembled due to the lack of strength. Just a speck of dust. The sin of hell's river roared, unwilling and indignant. King Kessel sneered and raised his hand to swing down. Unless, father, Thales gritted his teeth, ignoring the stinging pain in his neck. He felt that everything around him except for the pair of blue eyes had become dazed. We were born for constellation. Born for constellation. The Iron Hand King's expression changed. His hand gesture stopped in mid-air, motionless. Time seemed to stop at this moment. Stop. Retreat. 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 Lord Adrian spoke hurriedly, stopping a few royal guards who could not restrain themselves and wanted to make the first move before His Majesty gave the order. Well, Viscount Kenny took a deep breath and mustered up his courage to smooth things over. Why don't we? But Prime Minister Cullen's large palm hit him hard on the shoulder. The Minister of Trade's sincere words were smashed back into his stomach. The Duke of Eastern Sea was expressionless. He just put his index finger to his lips. Accustomed to all sorts of situations, he knew that this was a conversation that only Jade Star could participate in, a language that only the royal family could understand. The silent oppression lasted for a long time, until the king's voice came faintly. What are you going to do? His voice was like fine sand, and his words were like a blade hidden in a sheath. Thales took a deep breath and smiled. At this moment, his tone was relieved and relaxed. A quarter of an hour. The prince said absent-mindedly. Constellation, the entire kingdom, all we need is for us to be alone. A quarter of an hour. Gilbert's eyes widened. A few drops of scarlet blood seeped out from between Thales' sword and his collar and fell onto the meeting table. King Kessel did not answer. His gaze was fixed on the blood on the meeting table. 1 second. 2 seconds. Finally, the king slowly put down his left hand that was poised to strike. Instead, his right hand clenched into a fist and slammed it on the table. Everyone! King Kessel's voice was cold and stern. Stand down. As soon as he said this, the crowd burst into an uproar. Only Thales exhaled fiercely when he heard that. Damn it! The sin of hell's river subsided unwillingly. The prince took a few deep breaths. He fell back into his seat and put the load-bearing sword down between his knees. Only then did he realize that although winter had arrived, the hilt of the sword in his palm was already soaked in sweat. At this moment, no, Mariko. At that moment, the sin of hell's river in Thales' body suddenly woke up and roared violently. Oh no! Thales subconsciously wanted to raise his sword. But he was too late. Just like Adrian's exclamation. Thud. Thales only saw a shadow flash before his eyes. His chin hurt and he immediately saw stars. Bang! There was another muffled sound. Thales felt a sharp pain in his abdomen, and all his resistance was drained from his body. Asterisk clang. Asterisk under everyone's astonished gazes. The load-bearing sword fell to the ground and swayed endlessly. 3 seconds later, the dizzy Thales opened his eyes and panted in pain. The rebellion is over, Your Highness. The second vanguard of the royal guards, Mariko, pressed him firmly to the ground. His arms were locked under his armpits, and his knees were pressed against his neck, making it difficult for the prince to breathe and make a sound. This punch is for our brothers who guard the palace gate. The vanguard looked at the blood at the corner of the prince's mouth, and furiously retracted his fist before spitting to the side. Brat! Chapter 6:17. Damn it. This was Thale's first thought. Half of his face was pressed against the cold stone floor, and he could feel the dust and pain. From the moment the prince entered the room to force the emperor to abdicate and raise his sword against his neck, to the moment he was careless and was captured, the situation had changed in the blink of an eye, beyond imagination. The entire Ballard room was so shocked that they didn't even have time to react. Mariko, the center of attention, tightened his grip on Thale's twisted arm. He took a deep breath and reported to King Kessel with a face full of excitement. "Your Majesty, the intruder has been captured." King Kessel did not reply immediately. He only stared deeply at Thales on the ground. His face was as dark as the sea. No one knew what he was thinking. The royal guards were about to swarm forward, but Captain Adrian, who was frowning, raised his hand in a timely manner and stopped them 5 steps away. Many people finally reacted and heaved a sigh of relief. "Is it over?" Sauter stared blankly at the immobilized prince. Gilbert did not say a word. His face was dejected, and his eyes were red. Prime Minister Cullen remained silent as well, lowering his head in deep thought. God, thank sunset, I knew it." Major Domo Kirkirk struggled free of Solda's hand that was covering his mouth. He was still in a state of shock. Finally, the atmosphere in Ballard was no longer as oppressive as before. But Mariko keenly noticed that his superior Adrian, who was standing beside His Majesty, had a serious look on his face as he shook his head at him. The king's voice rang out, silencing the room once again. "By the looks of it." Kessel stared at Thales, who had slipped and been captured, and he seemed to be deep in thought. "It won't be that easy for you to commit suicide, child." Everyone had different moods, and their gazes all turned to the young captive on the ground. Of course. Thales tried his best to resist Mariko's suppression. He sucked in a mouthful of air between the dust and the ground and gritted his teeth. "Stop wasting time." Vanguard Mariko, who was riding on him, snorted disdainfully. Seeing that the Duke of Star Lake remained defiant and unruly despite his defeat, whispers broke out in Ballard Room. King Kessel narrowed his eyes. The sharp glint in his eyes almost tore Thales apart. Beside the meeting table, Gilbert, who had witnessed the entire process, heaved a long sigh and slowly stood up. "Your Majesty, as you said." The Foreign Affairs Minister was in a daze and did not look at Thales on the ground. "Prince Thales is overtired. He indeed needs rest." Kirkirk rolled his eyes. Your Majesty, why don't we call it a day?" "If there is a need, Your Majesty," Archdeacon Stylianides sighed and said, "the Sunset Church can confess the lost prince and redeem himself." "No." Viscount Kenny frowned and looked at his colleagues. "Everyone, today's matter concerns the stability of the kingdom. Please keep your mouth shut." The officials were all talking at once, and the meeting room became lively again. Silence. At this moment, Prime Minister Cullen suddenly shouted. The entire Ballard room fell silent. "It's a royal household affair." Out of character, the Duke of Eastern Sea turned to the king in a calm and unquestionable manner. "His Majesty has his own decision." Everyone looked at the end of the long table again. But King Kessel did not react. Half of his body was in the shadow of the throne, and only his head and chest were exposed to the light of the fire, which made his eyes flicker. The king's silence seemed to have a magical power as it gradually infected the entire meeting room. From the ministers to the guards, everyone could not help but fall silent. They did not even dare to breathe loudly. Except for one person. "Please, father." Even though the rebellion had failed, Thale's laughter was still unrestrained and piercing outside Ballard Room. "When the time comes, do you choose to be a stupid idiot, or a suicidal coward?" King Kessel's gaze grew sharper. Vanguard Mariko's expression turned cold. He exerted force on his knee and cut off Thale's words with a hiss of pain. At this moment, "Mariko." King Kessel's voice sounded faintly. "Let him go." At that moment, everyone was stunned. "Yes." Mariko first accepted the order excitedly, then reacted and looked up in shock. "Your Majesty? What did you say?" He was not the only one who had this question. But Prime Minister Cullen's expression was thoughtful, Gilbert's eyes lit up with hope, and more people had doubts and fear. Only one person was not surprised. On the ground, at an invisible angle, Thales endured the pain and curled the corners of his mouth. "I said." King Kessel snorted coldly. His voice was not loud, but it made everyone subconsciously quiet down. Jade Star has made a promise. The Iron Hand King gazed deeply at his unfilial son. As you wish, child. Let's talk. As the king's voice faded, there was a moment of silence in Ballard Room. Many people exchanged looks of bewilderment. Mariko took a deep breath, violently pulled Thales up from the ground, and pressed him heavily against the table, causing the latter to groan in pain. Your Majesty, Prince Thales is plotting a rebellion. Once he escapes, he may harm you. He was not the only one worried. The ministers in front of the king spoke at once. Alone. Advisor Sauter looked at the load-bearer's sword that had long been confiscated by the royal guards. But your Majesty, at least let Adrian be present to protect. Well, if we want to interrogate him, we can find a cell, the kind with bars. This was the shaken Chief Kirkirk. What about the Secret Intelligence Department? Let them handle it. No, today's matter is not to be leaked. Bang! There was a dull thud. It was King Kessel's heavy punch on the table. The teacups on the table rattled noisily. Everyone was shocked. The ministers and guards came to their senses. They lowered their heads and waited nervously for the king's reprimand. The room was instantly silent. But the Iron Hand King said nothing. He merely lowered his eyes and maintained his silence, calm and steady, like a hunter patiently waiting for his prey. A full 10 seconds. During this time, everyone lowered their heads and dared not breathe too loudly. Thales was still pinned against the table. He panted as he waited for the oppressive silence. Finally, Lord Adrian, who was closest to the king, sighed and took a step forward. His Majesty has made a decision. Royal guards, everyone, leave the room immediately. When the guards heard this order, they looked at each other in dismay. Sir. Mariko looked up hurriedly. We can't take the risk. The Emperor's Praetorian Guards. Guard Captain Adrian's expression changed, and he yelled, Why do you wave your sword? As soon as he said this, all the royal guards, including Mariko, were shocked. The king did not say a word and watched the scene coldly from the sidelines. Mariko glanced at Thales, who was pinned down by him, and swallowed with difficulty. This sword is only swung for the Emperor. It has no other use. Adrian nodded expressionlessly and did not say anything else. Seeing this, the ministers whispered to each other, but the guards looked solemn. The next moment, Thales felt his arm loosen. The pain, restraint, and weight on his body disappeared. By His Majesty's order, Your Highness. Vanguard Mariko took a step back and stared at the teenager on the table with vigilance and indignation. He gritted his teeth but was polite. Please rise. Thales groaned and propped himself up from the table in pain. F***ck. He spat out a mouthful of blood, panted, kicked a chair away and sat down heavily. Seeing that Thales had escaped, the expressions of the ministers changed slightly. The guards subconsciously put their hands on their weapons, but under Adrian's stern gaze, no one dared to act rashly. With a cold expression, Mariko bowed in the direction of the king and the commander, then turned around and arranged for the royal guards to leave the room in an orderly manner. My lords, the kitchen is ready for dinner, Lord Adrian said again, attracting the attention of the courtiers. Please. The guard captain raised his hand towards the door, his face beaming with joy and respect. It was as if this was just an ordinary court meal. From Gilbert to Sauter, from Kirkirk to Kenny, the ministers looked at each other. They looked troubled, doubtful, or worried, but none of them moved. King Kessel's gaze gradually turned cold. Just in time, I've been hungry for a long time. Let's eat, let's eat. Duke Cullen's cheerful voice rang out just in time to break the tension and awkwardness. The Prime Minister stood up excitedly and stuck out his belly. At that moment, he seemed to have reverted to the charmingly naive, pot-bellied Duke. Although Renaissance palaces' dishes are famous for being shabby and inflexible, and they never change. Just as they were about to reach the door, Prime Minister Cullen paused and turned around to give Thales a deep look. But I think there might be a surprise for this meal? There was a hidden meaning in his words, but no one dared to respond. Only the Iron Hand King snorted coldly. The Prime Minister chuckled, squeezed through the line of guards, and disappeared outside the door. Kirkirk, who had been fidgeting for a long time, looked left and right, shrugged with an awkward smile, and quickly caught up with the Prime Minister. With Kirkirk and Cullen as precedents, and the King's resolute attitude, the other ministers, despite their doubts and worries, did not delay. One by one, they filed out of the room. "Your Majesty, if you need anything," Sauter said solemnly before he left, "I'll be next door waiting to be summoned." King Kessel seemed to come back to life and nodded imperceptibly at the military advisor. "Don't worry, Sir Sauter." Thales tapped the arm of his chair and looked tiredly at King Kessel. "I'll take good care of him for you. This will be a frank, sincere, cordial and friendly conversation." The teenager narrowed his eyes. Father and son. King and prince. Jade Star and Jade Star. Thales snorted softly. "Isn't that so?" King Kessel did not respond, but his gaze deepened. Sauter frowned and turned around decisively. Gilbert was the last minister to leave. He looked hesitant and hesitated, but in the end, he could not help but turn around. "Your Majesty, even if the knot in your heart is difficult to resolve, please consider the fact that you are related by blood, and that His Highness is still young." King Kessel's gaze, sharp as a sword, turned and landed on the Foreign Affairs Minister. Gilbert paused for a moment. But Thales' voice rang out again. "Thank you, Gilbert." With his back to Gilbert, Thales smiled and said in an unquestionable tone, "But according to the standards of the age of the Empire, I am already an adult." Gilbert was startled. Thales turned around and flashed him a bright smile. "I can already wield a sword and fight, marry a wife and have children." King Kessel did not move, but Gilbert's gaze was complicated. The Foreign Affairs Minister sighed and said nothing else. He staggered away with his colleagues. Seeing that all the important figures had left, Adrian secretly breathed a sigh of relief. On the other side, Mariko led the last few royal guards out of Ballard Room while keeping an eye on Thales. "Be careful, Vanguard." Thales' sudden voice caused Mariko, who was holding the bearer, to stop in his tracks. "That sword is the heirloom of the Caribbean family." The prince turned his head. "It's very heavy." Mariko took a deep breath. But before he could reply, Adrian had already spoken. "The sword may be heavy." The chief guard captain came forward and tidied up Thales' messy clothes. He did not forget to tear off some clothes and bandage the wound on Thales' neck and shoulder. "But it is our duty to carry the burden for the royal family." Looking at Adrian, who was bandaging his wound, Thales' tone became much better. "Thank you, Lord Adrian. Please apologize to the guards at the palace gate on my behalf." "They do not need to apologize." Adrian interrupted the prince. His attitude was still gentle, but his gaze was different. What awaits them is the examination of the flag-bearer, the sentencing of the penal officer, and a lifetime record of dereliction of duty. Thales froze when he heard that. His tone became gloomy. "I am sorry." Lord Adrian smiled slightly, treated the prince's wound, and patted him on the shoulder. "I have already said, Your Highness." The chief guard captain nodded slightly. "It is our duty to carry the burden for the royal family." Mariko, who was behind him, snorted angrily. He pushed the bearer heavily against the ground and turned to leave. As Adrian was the last to leave, the door of Ballard Room closed with a bang. Only the king and the prince were left. They sat on opposite sides of the meeting table, facing each other under the illumination of the setting sun. Ballard Room was not large. It was crowded and lively when the imperial conference was held. But now that there were only 2 people left, it gave off a frightening feeling of loneliness. "Speak." King Kessel did not waste any time. His cold words rang from the other end of the meeting table, as if separated by mountains and seas. "How do you live for Constellation?" Thales did not answer immediately. He first touched the corner of his mouth, which was gradually becoming red and swollen. He cursed Mariko's old fist in his heart, then patted the seat under his butt and sighed with emotion. He finally sat down. After all, he had risked his life to get this seat. And it was not Gilbert who gave it up for him. And now, his battle was just about to begin. If you want to fight, be fully armed. As he thought of this, Thales raised his head and gave his opponent the most sincere smile. "Oh, I thought you didn't understand." The second prince picked up a teacup on the table. He did not care who had used it before, and drank the rest of the tea in one gulp. "Or you simply understood, but pretended not to know." "Jade Star." Hearing this surname, King Kessel moved slightly. Thales finished his tea and tossed the expensive teacup behind him. Crack. The king looked at the prince's rude and undisguised actions. His gaze turned slightly cold. Seeing his father's gaze, Thales wiped the tea stain from the corner of his mouth and snorted. All right, for the sake of this teacup, Baron Quinton would definitely criticize him in a sarcastic manner again. But who cares? I say, why don't you step down as well? Thales suddenly turned his head and looked at the void around him. Yodel? Hearing this name, King Kessel narrowed his eyes. But Ballard Room was silent. There was no response except for the flickering firelight. Instead, King Kessel snorted coldly and looked at his son thoughtfully. Thales did not wait for an answer, so he scratched his forehead and laughed self-deprecatingly. I thought he was here. King Kessel snorted coldly without mercy. Following Constellation's tradition, if a member of the royal family makes a mistake, the Iron Hand King's eyes were as sharp as blades, pinning him firmly to his seat. Their punishment will be personally carried out by the chief penal officer of the royal guards, from flogging to hanging. Penal officer. Personally carried out. Recalling the scene of Mallow's whipping Glover and Doyle, Thales was silent. Therefore, this position tends to favor those who scrupulously abide by the law, are impartial, and do not fear the powerful. King Kessel had no intention of waiting for Thales to answer. There was a hint of threat in his gaze. Based on what happened today, the second vanguard Marek is a good candidate. Marek. Candidate for penal officer. Thales recalled Marek's glare at him before he left. Feeling the pain in his chin and lower abdomen, the corners of his mouth twitched slightly. He said with a headache, yes, Vanguard Mareko is quite good. Even Cohen and Glover together couldn't take him down. Of course, these two big guys don't cooperate at all, and they get in each other's way. No matter what you're going to say next. King Kessel interrupted him coldly. Your foolish actions tonight have made the situation extremely ugly. The worst consequences have already occurred. Irreversible. King Kessel's gaze swept across him like a sword. The same goes for punishment. Including you and all those who followed you in your foolish actions. Punishment. Him. And the people who followed him. Wyatt, Ralph, Cohen, Glover, Doyle. When he recalled these people who followed him into Renaissance Palace in a muddle-headed manner, the corners of Thales' lips curled up. Just like 6 years ago, when they followed him into Heroic Spirit Palace, didn't they? The teenager exhaled and leaned against the back of the chair. All right, I admit. Now it seems that my actions were a little hasty, as well as risky. Thales shrugged and accidentally affected his injury. He could not help but grimace. I'll pay attention next time? Unfortunately, his father's face was still cold, and he had no intention of cheering for his joke. It seems that you have learned nothing in the Secret Intelligence Department. Still impulsive, stupid, ridiculous, lame. King Kessel used 4 adjectives to complete this sentence. Thales pursed his lips and nodded politely. Impulsive, stupid, ridiculous, lame. And do you know how many important things you've delayed on this occasion and at this time? I know. Thales answered quickly. But I also know, he collected himself, returned to his battlefield, and looked up at the king. As we speak, there are still people in the kingdom who are waiting, anxious and dying in despair. Thales' expression became serious. There are even more people who do not know what kind of fate awaits them. He met his father's gaze. So I had to come. Had to come? The Iron Hand King sneered, but there was no smile in his eyes. I didn't bring the crown, but I brought the head. The king's voice turned cold. Why do you want to come and get it? The setting sun just fell outside the window. Kessel V's figure was dark and blurry in the scarlet light. Thales smiled. He didn't bring the crown. But he brought the head. After King Nuvan's death, the blood-stained dragon-scale crown flashed before his eyes. The next moment, the sin of Hell's river surged in his veins. The prince's expression turned cold. His figure flashed and he pounced on the king. Swoosh. As the chair rubbed against the ground, Thales' expression was resolute. He leaned forward from his seat and suddenly extended his palm towards King Kessel opposite him. The Iron Hand King did not move. He was not surprised. He just stared coldly at the approaching Thales. Smack. With a muffled sound, Ballard Room returned to peace. The setting sun and firelight reflected Thales' figure in a bloody red light. His palm stopped above the meeting table, but was firmly restrained and could not move an inch. He was only a few feet away from King Kessel. The light flickered, causing the shadows to tremble, feeling the belated strong wind. "I say, you're really here." Thales was expressionless. He did not even look at the mysterious figure that suddenly appeared in front of him. Yodel. Yodel Kato, the masked protector he was all too familiar with, was kneeling on one knee on the meeting table. He held Thales' wrist tightly and protected the king behind him. Yodel did not answer. His mask was thick and rigid. His gloves were cold as ice. His movements were steady as usual. Thales looked at the place where his palm was and sighed. What a pity. Just a little more. The masked protector lowered his head slightly. On the table in front of the king, under Thales' fingers, lay a crumpled letter. On the cover, the iris-shaped wax was beautiful and exquisite. Yodel was momentarily stunned. He raised his head. The deep holes on the purple mask met Thales' eyes. "Let him go," the king's voice rang coldly. Thales curled his lips. He looked at the masked protector and raised his eyebrows. "I think he's talking about you?" Yodel was silent for a moment. In the next second, the air in front of Thales rippled and stirred up ripples. Yodel's figure became blurry. Faced with this familiar scene, Thales just stared at the mask, as if he could stare through it and stare straight into the other pair of eyes behind it. Soon, Thales felt his wrist loosen. The ripples disappeared completely. Thales felt the lingering pain on his wrist. He sighed and chased the hint of melancholy out of his heart. Since he had already made his decision, he had no spare energy to reminisce about the past. The teenager reached out to grab the letter, retreated from the meeting table, and sat back in his seat. "So, this is the letter But Leader was talking about." "But Leader?" King Kessel frowned. Thales explained absent-mindedly as he read the letter. "Oh, you know, the Secret Intelligence Department has a group called the Prince's But." "Forget it. It's not important." Seeing that the Iron Hand King did not care, Thales shrugged. He hastily scanned the elegant and calm words on the letter, and extracted the main points. TSK, paying taxes to serve, and supporting the budget of the regular army? Thales put down the letter, his eyes shining. "Congratulations. I'm sure Lord Sauter is very happy, and Lord Kirkirk is also very satisfied. Your wish to expand the regular army has been fulfilled, and everyone is happy?" King Kessel was silent for a while. "You broke the ban and barged into the palace," the king said faintly after a few seconds. "Treason of words and conspiracy of treason, is this what you're saying?" Thales laughed. His laughter was so loud that it resounded throughout Ballard Room. But the king's expression remained indifferent, and he only looked at him coldly. Until Thales' smile faded and he said solemnly, "Then where's the pit?" The Iron Hand King narrowed his eyes. His silhouette became brighter and clearer under the light, no longer a blurry shadow against the light. "Where's the pit?" Thales took a deep breath, leaned forward on the table, and raised the letter in his hand. "I say, this petition is both flattering and self-justifying. Not only does it want to pay taxes, it also wants to abolish military service, and it doesn't even care about tarnishing its reputation in order to make a public appeal for the nobles in the country to follow suit. Other than that," the teenager narrowed his eyes. "How many pits did Zayn Covendier leave for you?" At that moment, King Kessel's pupils flickered slightly. How many traps? How many difficult problems? How many obstacles? How many flowery, beautiful words? How many of his smiling, sinister intentions, while you clenched your teeth in exasperation and could not do anything to him? King Kessel did not answer, but the atmosphere around him grew colder. Seeing the other party's reaction, Thales snorted and shook his head. He did not press for an answer, and just leaned back in his chair again. "I know. Ever since he hired a vampire to assassinate me 6 years ago, and had to compensate you with a few crystal drop mineral deposits, your relationship with him has been pretty good. You and your subject get along well and cooperate at times. Or a deal. But believe me, Father, Zayn and I, we are old acquaintances." Thales stared at the letter in his hand, his gaze gradually turning cold. Better to die for a friend than to perish for an enemy. Compared to allies, enemies know each other better. The king looked at him carefully and was silent for a few seconds before he snorted. "Interesting. You know Jade City?" Thales looked up and shook his head decisively. No, I know nothing. King Kessel frowned. But I know that Zayan is not a lamb waiting to be slaughtered. Zayan's image appeared in front of him, leaving Thales in a daze. He prides himself on being virtuous, but he is good at scheming, and never makes a losing deal. He puts on airs in front of others, but seeks revenge for the smallest grievance behind their backs. He is an exquisite and troublesome egotistical bastard. Thales snapped out of his daze and looked at the king seriously. He will not accidentally lose a weapon at a banquet, or rather, he will not work himself to the bone for you and dedicate himself to a small matter like murdering the Prince of Constellation. The teenager's voice trailed off, but King Kessel's expression remained unchanged, cold as ever. It was as if he did not hear the sarcasm in his words. That's it, the king said flatly. Nothing else. Thales smiled. He observed King Kessel's reaction and found that, as usual, he could not sense the subtle changes in the other party's expression and movements. Even with Hell's senses, he could only see an iron wall and a cloud of fog. But so what? Of course, you know all this very well. You also know him and understand him, Thales said with certainty. You already knew. Even though you foresaw all kinds of unfavorable situations, knew that Zayan was not easy to deal with, knew that he would not go along with your wishes. The prince was resolute. But you still chose him. You still took the opportunity to blackmail him, threatened Jade City and South Coast Hill, and threatened him to solve the budget gap for the expansion of your regular army. Thales stared fixedly at King Kessel and suddenly had a realization. Neuven, Chapman, the Calamity, and now Kessel. Meet the enemy, observe the enemy, subdue the enemy. But it was another battle. King Kessel looked at him for a long time before he let out a faint, cold laugh. You're wasting my time. Why? Thales suddenly spoke, interrupting the king. Why does it have to be South Coast? Thales leaned forward slowly and pushed the letter from Iris Flowers to the other party. He spoke softly. He said softly, why does it have to be Zayan who provides the budget for your army expansion? To make the call for you to reduce the conscription? To open the door for you to reform the military system? To pull the war chariot of the kingdom for you? The king's gaze shifted. Humph. King Kessel sneered. Because he bumped into the door, because he was stupid enough to reach out to Renaissance Palace. Thales closed his eyes and took a deep breath. No. He opened his eyes gently. The reason it's South Coast is because of Zayan. Because you have no other choice. Thales stared fixedly at the Iron Hand King. And the reason you have no other choice. But Thales could not finish. Before your people suffer along with you. King Kessel looked annoyed and gradually lost his patience. Don't you have anything else to say? With a rumble, Thales stood up, gritted his teeth and slammed the table. Bang! Because of Western Desert. Thales roared, interrupting the king's words. At that moment, the Sin of Hell's river rolled over, helping Thales roar so loudly that it shook Ballard Room. Western Desert. The prince's voice was so loud that the candlelight flickered and the shadows trembled. Western Desert. Upon hearing this name, King Kessel's sharp gaze froze in mid-air. Your Majesty? Anxious knocks and questions came from outside the door. Your Majesty? What happened? Please answer me. But at that moment, both Thales and King Kessel in the room had no time or intention to pay attention to the voices outside the door. Their eyes met in the air, like two swords intertwining, sparks flying as they rubbed against each other. Because your first choice, your best choice, is the horse you've reserved to pull your chariot. Amid the rapid banging on the door, Thales enunciated each word clearly. He used all the strength in his body to force these words out of his mouth. It should have been Western Desert. Not South Coast. At that moment, his gaze turned into the sharpest blade, piercing Kessel's eyes. With a bang, the door opened. A group of royal guards led by the second vanguard, Mariko, rushed in anxiously. I knew there would be an accident. Protect His Majesty, take down the traitor. But in the next second King Kessel, who was sitting on the throne, turned his head abruptly and roared, Get out! Mariko's words came to an abrupt halt. He looked at the unharmed but furious King Kessel and was suddenly at a loss. Your Majesty, I thought. But the Iron Hand King no longer paid attention to Mariko. He just frowned and stared at Thales. But Thales smiled. Father. The prince took a deep breath and became more certain of his guess. He could not help but smile. Why are you so angry? King Kessel restrained his anger. His breathing gradually stabilized, but his gaze grew colder. Step down, Vanguard Mariko. Thales returned to his seat, still having the time to reach out and tidy his collar. At this moment, although his face was covered in dust, he looked surprisingly elegant and calm. We are all decent people, not northern barbarians who would kill their brothers to usurp the throne or rebel against the king. Mariko gritted his teeth angrily. By the way, Your Excellency Vanguard. Thales' smile was bright and gentle. He clamped his right thumb and index finger into a right angle, and playfully made a shooting gesture at Mariko. His Majesty thinks very highly of you. Mariko was taken aback. Captain Adrian's hand reached out from behind, pressed on the back of his shoulder, and pulled him away in an irrefutable manner. Only then did the dutiful Mariko realize that the Jade Star's conversation could not be understood with common sense. The door closed again. Only then did Thales notice that at some point, the sunset outside the window had completely disappeared. All that was left was the chill of the night. Why? The king's voice rang coldly. Although it was only a question, Thales knew what he wanted to ask, just like before. A few months ago, when I was still in the headquarters of the Secret Intelligence Department in Dragoncloud City, worrying about how to escape back to the kingdom, Putray told me that behind the rescue plan, countless people in Constellation worked hard day and night. Thales' thoughts flew back to Dragoncloud City. He said faintly, so I asked him, was it worth it? Putray. King Kessel repeated the name, his eyes bright. Putray Nemain, he told you? But Thales ignored him. He was just immersed in his own past in a daze. The entire constellation mobilized. Thousands of soldiers went deep into the desert. Countless officials came one after another. You even handed over Bladefang's camp, which was directly under the royal family, and let go of the western battlefront that you had controlled for many years. Such a big battle and sacrifice, just to welcome back an insignificant hostage prince who had been silent for 6 years in a foreign country. Thales sighed, returned to the present, and looked straight at the Iron Hand King. Was it worth it? Not a bad question. Kessel V stared at Thales coldly and disdainfully. But you have a terrible answer. A terrible answer. Thales snickered, looked at the ceiling, and shook his head in a self-deprecating manner. Of course not. King Kessel did not speak. His silhouette flickered under the illumination of the everlasting lamp. Thales raised the letter in his hand. In 6 years, from the vampire to the banquet, I was murdered twice by Covendier. At that moment, his eyes were filled with complicated emotions. One after the other, you did not forget to ask for compensation from iris flowers, and made a lot of money. You haggled over the smallest details, you were calculative, and you were shrewd and calculative, father. How could you be willing to mobilize the entire country, spend countless resources, and lose an important military town just to do a loss-making business in exchange for an impulsive, stupid, ridiculous, lame? Thales paused for a moment, and sarcastically spat out the last word. Son. When he heard Thales use his own words against him, Kessel snorted coldly, unbothered. What, are you here to complain to me? Son. Thales snorted softly and laughed self-deprecatingly. No, in fact, when I was in Western Desert, I vaguely knew that you had other motives for sending troops here. Thales' thoughts returned to the faraway Ghost Prince Tower. After experiencing the chaotic night in Bladefang's camp and seeing the legendary Wing's untamed nature, I thought you wanted to use the opportunity of my return to the country to beat down those suzerains of Western Desert who dared to use me as a bargaining chip to demand Bladefang's camp and the Western front lines. To show your authority as a king and strike down the local forces of power. In the next moment, Thales' smile disappeared. But I was still too naive, too immature. The teenager stared at the king. Until today, until this imperial conference, until this letter. Kessel V did not say a word under the dim firelight. But his gaze as he looked at Thales gradually changed. A few months ago, father, the reason why you gathered the royal regular army of an unprecedented scale and entered Western Desert to join forces with the local suzerains was because... Thales' eyes dimmed. It was not to intimidate Northland and bring back the prince, much less to recapture Bladefang's camp and beat down the suzerains of Western Desert. It was for a higher, greater, and more shocking grand goal that could affect the future of the kingdom and even the world. At that moment, King Kessel's gaze sharpened like never before. Yes, I underestimated you. Thales took a deep breath, and with a stern expression, he called out the king's name. Kessel Jadestar. I also forgot that you are not a merchant in the marketplace, but the king of a country. Your thoughts and desires are not limited to a single item, not even a city or a place. The light flickered, and the shadows trembled. The Iron Hand King stared at his son from afar, like a falcon staring at its prey. Thales furrowed his eyebrows tightly, feeling an unprecedented weight and pressure. You should not be described as haggling over every penny, being calculative and shrewd, but as, Thales gritted his teeth and stared at the Iron Hand King in front of him as if he was looking at the most terrifying enemy in the world. Stubborn and obstinate. Insatiable greed. Bone-crushing and marrow-sucking. Kessel did not speak. Thales stared at his father, just as the other man's gaze was fixed on him. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds. Now, Yodel. Just when Thales thought he could no longer withstand the king's gaze, Kessel V's emotionless voice rose into the air. You may leave. Chapter 6:18. Thales subconsciously turned his head to look around, but the narrow Ballard room was still quiet. There was no movement at all. The sun had set, and the lights were faint. Only King Kessel's cold gaze pierced towards him from afar, like a knife to his throat. How nice! Thales sighed and gave up on trying to find Yodel. He's never been so obedient when we were outside. Thales narrowed his eyes and tried to adjust his mood, just like relaxing his muscles and joints before a big battle. But are you sure he really left? But the Iron Hand King's answer was simple and direct, his tone cold and unhesitant. You have 15 minutes. 15 minutes. Thales was silent for a second. Clearly, this was not the time to talk about a father and son reunion. As he thought, he snorted and nodded. Not bad. You know, the Northland barbarians only gave me 2 minutes back then. Kessel V snorted coldly. And you've already wasted half of it. His tone made Thales feel pressured. Listening to Kessel's merciless words, Thales had no choice but to take a deep breath and brace himself. After all, he had already come so far and sacrificed so much. To come to the windmill that belonged to him. Wasn't it? At this thought, Thales put away his expression and put on a stern face. After last night's banquet, you extorted this petition from Little Flower. The Duke of Iris Flowers, forcing him to pay taxes as a substitute laborer, and calling for the rest of the country to follow suit. Thales leaned forward slightly and pressed the letter on the table. Now it seems that you did that to solve the problem of today's Imperial Conference. Lord Sauter wants to expand the regular army, and is in urgent need of money and reputation. King Kessel shifted his gaze to the petition, and did not say a word. That's why you and Advisor Sauter are echoing each other in Ballard Room today, Thales said coldly with a cold gaze. Or rather, it was the two of you who communicated with each other in advance. He charged in front, and you sat in the tent, coordinating with each other from inside and outside. But his words obviously did not have any effect. You must be a genius to have seen through the dark side of the kingdom. King Kessel mocked him expressionlessly, completely unaffected. Why didn't the other lords at the Imperial Conference think of this? Thales frowned slightly. Yes, this matter is very obvious. Perhaps even the Star Killer can see it. The ministers just don't want to expose it. Or, he didn't dare to say it out loud. In the next second, Thales' expression changed. But something isn't right. The youth picked up Zayn's letter and leaned forward. Timing. King Kessel narrowed his eyes. Thales fixed his gaze on him. Neither of them spoke. The flame of the everlasting lamp flickered, and the entire conference room was illuminated by ripples. Shadows flickered. It was as if he was at the bottom of the sea, enduring the surging undercurrents. An accident that happened last night has solved this morning's problem? Thales spoke slowly, his eyes never leaving the Iron Hand King's face. What a coincidence. King Kessel did not react, as if this was just a bunch of nonsense to him. Thales flung the letter in his hand and shook his head gently. But there are no coincidences in politics. You want it? Did you foresee and arrange the accident at the banquet in advance? Waiting for Zayn to come knocking on my door and offend me so that I can use him against me? Extortion. You want it? Did you improvise and force Zayn to write the petition on a whim after the accident at the banquet? Instructed Lord Sauter to propose it in front of the Emperor? Made a prompt decision and did it in one go. Ballard Room was silent for a moment. Self-righteous? Baseless assumptions. King Kessel appeared disdainful. The Secret Intelligence Department's evaluation of you is indeed correct. But Thales smiled lightly. He nodded. That's it. This letter? Whether it was premeditated or impromptu, I still feel that something is wrong. Thales' gaze froze. Until I obeyed your orders and went to the Secret Intelligence Department. At that moment, the Iron Hand King frowned slightly. Thales' speech sped up and became urgent. First of all, I confirmed that Anchor Byral's assault at the banquet was not instigated by anyone, at least not by you. The motionless King Kessel made Thales feel as if he was talking to a stone statue. But he knew that he was not. If I hadn't shouted in public, no one would have known that it was Zayn who brought the weapon. Putting the conflict between Byral and Doyle on the table is not beneficial to the kingdom's governance, nor is it in your interest. Thales shook his head and said with certainty, At least I can confirm one thing. The accident at the banquet was not part of your plan. King Kessel did not comment. He only added a few words softly. They're letting you meet the felon. The Secret Intelligence Department is too lenient with you. Thales smiled politely in response. Secondly, let me go to the Secret Intelligence Department to take a look at my mess, so that I'll be more obedient. The king snorted coldly. Obviously, you didn't learn anything. Thales adjusted his breathing and looked down at the cut on his left hand. He recalled what the Black Prophet had said in the interrogation room. What's important isn't what you do, whether you do it or not, or whether you do it right or wrong. It's just that you are there. It's your position and existence. Under the power of power, your position is different from others, and the gap is set. No matter what you do in the upper reaches of power, what's bound to happen will happen. Thales looked up. That's right. Sitting in this position, every move I make is of great significance and far-reaching. Whether it's because I don't like to drink, or only eat lettuce, or accept duels, or help the Northlanders smuggle. Whatever is good at the top is bad at the bottom. I should see, know, and be responsible for the consequences of my actions. Very well, King Kessel said with a light snort. Then have you thought about how you're going to be responsible for the prince's rebellion? But in the next second, Thales' expression turned serious and he changed the topic. But what's bound to happen will happen. Thales paused for a moment and said decisively, Later someone told me, do you know how many hurdles you have to go through, from finance to the market, from taxes to the budget, from administration to the people's livelihood, from top to bottom, from one end of the chain to the other? Thales sneered and pointed at the darkness outside the window. Do you think this is a marionette show, where the gangsters on the streets will start when the king moves his fingers? At that moment the king's gaze flickered. Who said that? He said coldly. But Thales shook his head and did not answer. So, after connecting it with what I saw and heard at the royal banquet, I thought of more. As Thales spoke, he propped himself up on the edge of the table and locked his gaze on the king. These days, the Central Territory, especially the agriculture, medicine, tobacco, alcohol, forging, leather, textiles, and other industries around the capital have all experienced a rare, substantial, and long-term upheaval. And that is not something that can be affected by Thales Jadestar's behavior alone. At that moment, King Kessel raised his chin slightly. Even though it was only for a moment, Thales captured this detail. So I began to suspect that behind the prince likes lettuce, but the farmer starves to death, public opinion and propaganda. He took a deep breath and recalled the series of encounters from the banquet to the Secret Intelligence Department, to Red Street Market, and Lower City District. Thales' gaze sharpened. What is the Secret Intelligence Department trying to hide? What is happening in the kingdom? Thales' voice faded away. The cold wind poured into the room, blowing the flame of the everlasting lamp into a mess. The light and shadows were a mess. What answered him was the king's snort. Groundless accusations and baseless conjectures. King Kessel turned his head and buried one side of his face in the darkness. He seemed to be in low spirits. Are you done with the conspiracy theories? A wave of indignation welled up in Thales' heart. It was both familiar and unfamiliar. So I saw it. The teenager unconsciously raised his voice and spoke faster. Whether it is the gap between the supply and demand of food and wine production, or the unprecedented shortage of various medicinal herbs that has raised the market price of medicine, or the conflict between the criminal gangs that revolve around the imbalance of market interests, the Northlanders who want to privately buy food for the winter but run into trade barriers, the abnormal flow of people from the frontier to the inland, and the craftsmen of the foundry industry are constantly being secretly recruited by the army, and perhaps even more. Thales subconsciously clenched his teeth. At that moment, it was as if he had returned to heroic Spirit Palace and faced the 6 archdukes of Northland, and the archduchess. All of these tremors at the end of the power chain, they are not the normal state of the market, nor are they the effects of a prince has a thin waist. They are more like the mess left behind after a certain power intervenes in various industries. Mass production, material hoarding, population movement, goods movement, centralized allocation, and they have to be carried out in secret to deceive the public. At this moment, the king suddenly spoke and interrupted him. "Where?" Thales was startled. "Where?" King Kessel spoke faintly, his voice deep and powerful. "After leaving the secret intelligence department." His body leaned forward on the table and his face emerged from the shadows. Like a lion striding forward, he looked for the best position to pounce. "Where else did you go? What did you do? Who did you meet?" Each of King Kessel's words was slower than the last, but each was more urgent than the last. There was a hint of danger. "Where did I go? What did I do? Who did I meet?" Thales paused slightly. One night of romance, Laurel Club, Grove Pharmacy, Sunset Bar, Abandoned House. Cohen, Sissy, Lillian, Tinker, Groff, Morris, Leyork. All of them. His past. Thales clenched his fists. But he took a deep breath and dispelled the faint fear he had when facing the king. In its place was 100-fold vigilance and carefulness in the face of a powerful enemy. "Let me think." He leaned back in his chair and smiled. His voice was confident and relaxed. Red Street Market. Lower City District. Prostitutes. Brawls. Men, women. And people outside of these too. King Kessel frowned. Thales smiled as usual. "If you ask Buttass leader or those who are following me in the dark, they'll probably tell you this." The next second, the king's frown slowly relaxed. "That beggar's den, right?" King Kessel snorted softly, as if he was talking about a trivial matter. "After so many years, you still belong there. Beggar's den. Every time you're injured, you still run back, feeling wronged, like a cub returning to its mother's arms. You cry loudly and find your courage there." As his voice faded, King Kessel turned his head and glanced at him lightly. Thales shuddered slightly. He looked at the king's gaze and suddenly understood. Thales knew where the indignation that was both familiar and unfamiliar at the same time came from. The teenager recognized that gaze from the king. 6 years ago, he was brought back from the abandoned house by Yodel. It was the first time he saw this dignified man in Mindy's hall. At that time, the man had the same expression on his face. Disdain. Indifference. Indifference. Thales closed his eyes and took a deep breath. But this time, a long time ago, the moment I was taken away by my grandfather, everything changed. Glover's dejected words rang in his ears. "We, Lillian, Tinker, we can't go back. Forever." The teenager opened his eyes abruptly. "So, from the above, I've confirmed the second point." Thales' expression was cold and stern as he grabbed the letter from Iris Flower. "What this letter involves is not something you came up with on the spur of the moment, father." King Kessel frowned, as if he was surprised. Thales enunciated his words clearly and his logic gradually smoothed out. He broke through the layers of awkwardness he once felt when he faced the king. Long before Lord Saldus' radical proposal, the large-scale expansion of the regular army of the royal family had already begun in an orderly but unstoppable manner, in the entire Central Territory, and in all walks of life. Rations, supplies, equipment, weapons, logistics routes, and even possible future sources of conscription and garrisons, were already in full swing and were in full swing. If we take into account the time taken to conceive, plan, prepare, investigate, coordinate, mobilize and take action, it may have lasted several months or even a year or two, and has far-reaching implications. It's almost like a war mobilization, just that it's more low-key, more sneaky, no loud outcry, no declaration of war, to avoid market turbulence, and to prevent anyone from noticing anything amiss. Thales narrowed his eyes. So much so that the kingdom's secret intelligence department has no choice but to cover up leaks everywhere, and even use the prince's name. King Kessel's gaze turned sharp. Smack! Thales slapped Zayan's letter onto the table. From this, it can be seen that Lord Saldus' expansion proposal wasn't as simple as informing you and getting your approval. He stared intently at the king's cheek and said coldly, "You and the kingdom's secret intelligence department, you must have been planning this for a long time, and determined to succeed." Ballad Room fell into a long silence. Humph. A few seconds later, the Iron Hand King's snort sounded faintly. "In that case, you're not too stupid after all. At least a little smarter than the money-minded Kirk. Why would Banker promote him back then?" Seeing the king's reaction, Thales was even more certain of his judgment. He chuckled, forgetting the previous oppressive feeling. That brings us to the next question. If Zayan's letter in support of the expansion wasn't premeditated by you, but the expansion proposal wasn't something you came up with on the spur of the moment. Thales' expression turned serious. His voice was slightly cold. "Then what exactly are you up to?" In the face of the prince's questioning, King Kessel responded in silence, but his gaze grew sharper. Thales pried open his fingers and began to speak. From secretly preparing for the expansion, to the accident at the royal banquet, to blackmailing Zayan's letter, to the debate at the imperial conference regarding the expansion, all these steps to achieve the goal, some were clearly planned and prepared, while others were purely coincidental. He sneered. "Don't tell me that when it comes to the politics of the kingdom, you can still plan half by chance, half by calculation and half by luck?" King Kessel responded with an equally cold smile. "Isn't that what you're doing now?" The king clicked his tongue, breaking into the palace to seek a voice, killing people to gain an audience. "Half by calculation and half by luck?" Thales' words faltered. He paused and exhaled softly, reminding himself not to fall into the other party's trap. Then, I remembered this morning's imperial conference. Today, Lord Sauter spoke highly of the drawbacks of conscription and advocated for the expansion of the regular army, but met with unprecedented opposition. Starting from the Prime Minister, most of the people at the imperial conference were caught off guard and unprepared for this proposal, whether it was finance, diplomacy, agriculture, or production. The Department of Finance was short of funds and had no budget, public opinion and morality were not in their favor, and the various departments were complaining about the lack of resources. King Kessel's gaze shifted. Thales realized that although the statue-like king remained silent, he was no longer expressionless. This discovery caused him to be extremely excited. It was as if an invincible and flawless formation had finally been broken through after a series of attacks. The conditions and situation were not sufficient. Even if everyone knew that this was your intention, Saldus' proposal was met with heavy resistance. In the end, he could only lower his demands and make repeated concessions, limiting the reform of the military system to Eternal Star City and the Jade Star Private Army. Thales changed the topic. "That's why I'm even more puzzled. You, the Kingdom's Secret Intelligence Department, and Lord Sauter had been planning for a long time. A large-scale national policy decision that had already been quietly rolled out in secret. Why didn't you inform your own people beforehand? And didn't you inform them at the Imperial Conference? So that when it came down to it, you ran into a situation where the kingdom was strapped for cash, and the vassals objected in unison. You lacked money, reputation, and manpower. After Mendes III spent more than 100 years to weaken their economic, political, cultural, diplomatic and status privileges. You, Iron Hand King Kessel V, you wanted to command the power of thousands of troops, the might of a thunderbolt, the speed of lightning, and the momentum of a tidal wave. On this piece of land in Western Desert, completely and thoroughly sweep the natural military rights of the feudal lords and feudal lords since the founding of the country into the trash heap of history. Thales stared at the silent King Kessel, but could not help but think of Chapman Lampard, whom he had faced in heroic Spirit Palace. Once you succeed, the Western Desert families as illustrious as Fakenhas and as insignificant as Byril will completely become rich men and landlords with empty titles and assets, leaving only their genealogy and history, but no longer able to resist the might of the king. And eventually expand to the whole country, forging a new normal of Constellation's rule. Thales said faintly, completing the sage's chess game, the ultimate step. King Kessel did not speak. He just stared at the second prince with a profound gaze. All of this. Finally, after a while, King Kessel's voice came softly. Did you think of it yourself? Thales's gaze shifted. Of course not. Someone told me. King Kessel's gaze shifted. Who? Thales raised his head and accepted it calmly. Everyone. King Kessel looked puzzled. Thales showed a smile. From the nobles at the top to the common people at the bottom. Even you. Your Majesty. King Kessel frowned hard. But Thales snorted. Do you remember what you said to me the first time I met you after returning to the country? That sword. And that it was because of that sword that I became the Duke of Star Lake. King Kessel narrowed his eyes. The Duke of Star Lake looked up, his eyes glowing. And the reason why you were so dissatisfied with me accepting Fakenhaz's sword, Thales said coldly, not because of what has already happened, but because of the things that should have happened in Western Desert in your plan, but did not happen in the end. King Kessel's eyes slowly widened. Yes, your operation in the West Baron failed. You didn't follow your original plan to complete your military reform in the West Baron under the rare conditions. And the horse stumbled and fell short of success, not because of anything else. It is precisely because... Thales raised a finger and pointed at himself gently. Me. The prince's voice faded away. Ballard Room was dead silent, and there was silence everywhere. For a full 10 seconds, the Iron Hand King did not respond at all. But the way he looked at Thales slowly changed. From the previous disdain and indifference, it became, now I know. Finally, Kessel V spoke softly. How did you survive in the north? Polaris. Polaris. Under the table, Thales clenched his fists tightly. He was not mistaken. What happened to Anchor Byril and his father was not an isolated case, much less a coincidence. Because in the Sand King's plan, the Dukes of Western Desert were destined to be attacked by the forces of the desert, or even friendly fire from the legendary wing and the regular army, losing everything. Queen Kessel leaned back in her chair and nodded. When Western Desert suffered a crushing defeat and the war situation became urgent, his gaze sharpened. For the sake of the overall situation, in order to recapture the extraordinary Blade Fang's camp, the regular army of the royal family, who came late, had no choice but to break tradition and act at their own discretion. They punished and deprived the incompetent noble generals, and dispersed the defeated soldiers of the conscription army and reorganized them. Naturally, it was only right and proper, and they had no reason to resist. Thales exhaled and continued, but accidents always happen in war. If things don't go well during the reorganization, and progress isn't good. King Kessel's gaze shifted and looked at him. Thales paused. He recalled his first meeting with Mallows and understood a little. I'm guessing that since the heir of the kingdom is in Western Desert, for the sake of the kingdom's bloodline, Renaissance Palace would also be justified in sending reinforcements there to deal with accidents, such as the troops you sent to welcome me. Thales recalled the confrontation between the Western Desert Army and the regular army on the Avenue of Blessings. King Kessel did not speak. Thales said in a daze, as for the aftermath, what's done can't be undone. Whether it's the disbanded and reorganized conscription army, the nobles who are punished and stripped of their commanding rights, the families who have their conscription rights revoked, or Western Desert Hill, which has its military jurisdiction redrawn. Everything you want will be temporarily passed down in Western Desert under the guise of the Emergency Control Order, and in the name of wartime exceptions, just like Bladefang's camp and Blessings Town. Thales recalled what the Count of Wingfort, Derek Chroma, had said to him during the escort. He could not help but be lost in thought. 1 year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years until... forever. King Kessel snorted disdainfully, seemingly dissatisfied. The lights flickered, and the shadows in the room swayed back and forth, illuminating the surroundings so that it was bright and dark. It was turbulent. Thales took a deep breath. He returned to the present and adjusted his state of mind. When people slowly got used to the idea that only a king can have an army, The reform of the military system in all of Constellation also had precedents to follow. When the conditions were right, success would follow. Thales suddenly remembered the great battle he saw in the desert. Just like a cavalry charge. No matter how flawless a defensive formation is, once a gap is breached and the flanks are exposed, he said in a daze, what's left is a wave sweeping through, like a hot knife through butter. King Kessel still did not speak. But this time, he turned his gaze away and no longer looked at Thales. What a sand king! Thales could not help but sigh. In that case, Western Desert is really a good horse. It can completely pull the chariot of the kingdom. But, until you appeared. The king's voice suddenly rang, interrupting Thales' thoughts. The prince could not help but frown. The Secret Intelligence Department's report after the incident stated that you encountered the regular army's patrol unit in the Great Desert, but you did not meet up with them according to the plan. Instead, you concealed your identity and disappeared without a trace. The king's words seemed to have power. Accompanied by the howling of the cold wind outside the window, the everlasting lamp in the room kept flickering. Thinking of the past, Thales hesitated. But King Kessel did not allow the prince to interrupt. His gaze became sharp and cold. On the night the operation started, you mysteriously appeared in the eye of the storm, and you even brought quite a lot of friends with you. Shadow Shield, Northlanders, Secret Room, and even quite a number of sword sellers followed you into the Prison of Bones. One-day tour? Thales' heart tightened. About this? The king snorted coldly and no longer looked at him. The people at the Western front lines do not have the boldness of those in Renaissance Palace. They are cowardly and hesitant, not daring to take the risk of losing their heirs, so they bided their time and dispersed their manpower, causing the operation to be seriously disjointed. And our spies should have urged the warlike orcs and barren bone people to attack the suzerain's army while the regular army was away, but they seem to have sensed something beforehand. Not only did their main force not come, even their siege was just a feint, and they retreated the moment they came into contact. When Thales heard this, he could not help but say, yes, I heard that there is an orc called Kandarl in the desert. But in the next second, King Kessel's gaze was like a blade. Thales put away his smile and decided not to say anything else. It's fine. The king ignored him. Instead, he stared at a weak and drifting everlasting lamp. The coldness and dissatisfaction in his gaze was clear. Williams was lying in ambush at the side of Blade Fang's camp. His next tone was slightly regretful. However, that Western Desert bumpkin is especially sensitive to the slightest disturbance at his doorstep. Before he could reel in the fish, the line was cut. Thales was stunned. Reel. A tangent. Derek and Anchor's words continued to appear. Baron Amore recruited soldiers and mobilized his army, intending to cross Western Desert and create a big news for all of Constellation to protest against His Majesty and the kingdom. So much so that he decided to abandon his tacit understanding with the three main families and act rashly. Thales froze in his seat. It's you, Thales said in a daze. Baron Amore raised his army to protest because you secretly pressured him and deliberately instigated him? To find an excuse to intervene in Western Desert? The Iron Hand King scoffed. As I said, he's just one of them. One of them. At that moment, Thales thought of Anchor, who was tortured and bruised in the Secret Intelligence Department, and his lover, whose family was ruined and whose identity was unknown. So the tragedy of Baron Amore being silenced and his entire family killed. Thales' voice was hoarse. You're the instigator. Thales stared blankly at the table in front of him. The king's figure was projected on the opposite wall, dark and oppressive. These people. Their misfortune. But the dust that power crushed. You flatter me. The king's voice was still calm as if he did not care. I didn't ask the Western Desert bumpkins to silence them. Nor did I ask them to be ruthless enough to wipe out the entire family in the castle, including the militia and servants. Not a single person was left alive. Looks like they learned a lot from Williams. Silence them. Everything was wiped out. Amore. Viral. and that miserable family in Blessings Town whose name he could not recall, and that night in Bladefang's camp, where countless families were destroyed. Nobles, nobles, ha, these scumbags, what kind of F** king trash are they? On the land of barren rocks, the sentiments of the Raven of Death echoed in his ears. At the thought of this, an indescribable weariness came over him. The youth could not help but feel suffocated. Thales took a deep breath, trying to maintain his emotions. I understand. The prince lowered his head, avoiding the other person's gaze, holding back the disgust in his words. I see, good plan. No, it's not good. But King Kessel's voice still penetrated his eardrums unstoppably. We underestimated the Western Desert people's sharpness and decisiveness. Not only did we get a headless case with no evidence, but we also alerted them and made them even more vigilant. The king's gaze sharpened. Until now. Thales trembled slightly. King Kessel raised his head abruptly. It's not that there's no evidence, right? You have evidence. His attitude was firm and unquestionable. Thales' arm tensed. Evidence. Anchor's final voice echoed faintly. The matter of Amole town, including this bargaining chip, was indeed given to me by the Duke of Western Desert, through some means. The king let out a snort, as if he had expected it. And you accepted it, listened to the bewitchment of that old bone, came before me, and bargained arrogantly. Without waiting for him to reply, King Kessel shook his head slowly. Stupid. Impossibly stupid. Thales clenched his fists under the table. Yes, threats, coercion, flattery, deception, no matter which method, could not restrain the Iron Hand King. But so what? He was no longer the child beggar who shivered in the abandoned house. Not anymore. And King Kessel was no longer the tall figure he could only look at from afar in Mindy's Hall 6 years ago. To fight against an opponent like King Kessel, what he needed was not lies, concealment, or quibbling, but to rise to the challenge. Thales fixed his gaze on the king's face. In that case, there is even more reason for me to come forward and write a letter to the Duke of Western Desert, my father. He leaned forward and said sincerely, so that everyone can take a step back and solve the problem in a way that is acceptable to many parties. The new Sand King may not be so swift, and it may last for months or even years, but it will not be so tragic, and there will not be unmanageable consequences. You will eventually achieve your goal, and they will not have to bleed. The Iron Hand King sneered. He lowered his head, and his face was slowly shrouded in darkness. Why? Thales furrowed his eyebrows. I will bring out the witness of this case and let her testify, so that the suzerains of Western Desert will fall apart and become the target of public criticism. The king's gaze was cold. Then, I will let the regular army of the royal family enter Western Desert to punish the wicked. It will also achieve its goal. Thales was shocked. Indeed. Thales spoke again, trying to grasp the topic. But forgive me for being blunt, the reason why Faken has offered this bargaining chip was to lower himself and take the initiative to show weakness, to cool down the growing conflict between Renaissance Palace and the suzerains of Western Desert. He is not that kind and kind. King Kessel suddenly leaned forward and shouted angrily, startling Thales. And you are the only one who would be so stupid. The king glared at his son. Faken has gave me a bargaining chip so that I could clean up Western Desert, reform the kingdom, and achieve my goal. He changed the topic. But only through you? Thales stared at the king in a daze. The Iron Hand King leaned back in his chair and sneered. No. He gouged out his own flesh and blood to give you a sword, a bargaining chip. It was definitely not for you to be the peacemaker. The youth felt a chill in his heart. King Kessel narrowed his eyes. His gaze was like a sharpened blade. Yes, just like Quentin, Adrian answered without hesitation, but he realized something was wrong halfway through his sentence. He chuckled and said, "You're right." He chuckled and said, maybe it's still different." There was a moment of silence in the room. The king turned his head and glanced at Thales, who had a complicated expression on his face. "You take good care of him." "Of course." Adrian did not even blink and answered without hesitation, as if he could not read between the lines. "Mariko is still young. He should run more errands and train more." Bang! The king slammed his palm on the chair. "Adrian!" King Kessel snorted angrily, his gaze as sharp as a sword. "You've made up your mind to go against my wishes?" Adrian's expression turned solemn. "It's my fault, your majesty." He took a step back and bowed deeply. "It may not go against your wishes," the guard captain said respectfully, "but it suits your needs." King Kessel stared coldly at his guard captain, anger boiling in his eyes. "Suits your needs." Thales watched the confrontation between Adrian and the king in silence. Dinner together. He suddenly understood what the other party was doing. But what's the point? His battle in Renaissance Palace? 10 seconds of silence. King Kessel did not answer, but the anger in his eyes slowly faded. "It's Gilbert. Did he beg you to soothe his cheeks?" Adrian looked up. He was confused at first, but then came to a sudden realization. "What?" "Oh, your majesty, if you want to summon Count Casso, I'll..." King Kessel exhaled, feeling a little helpless and annoyed. "Enough, get lost." The king waved his hand impatiently. "I'll give you 5 minutes. Come back and take him away." Lord Adrian nodded, obedient and convinced. "As you wish." But the guard captain's footsteps immediately stopped. "But from an outsider's point of view, Your Highness will at least have to finish your meal and chat before leaving with me," Adrian said awkwardly. "A quarter of an hour?" "A quarter of an hour?" The king and Thales were stunned for a second. Clang! In the next second, King Kessel, who could not take it any more, knocked over his wine glass and glared at Adrian. "Ed." "Yes, your majesty." Lord Adrian bowed and hurriedly replied before the king. "Lord Adrian." "Then a quarter of an hour it is." Once he finished speaking, without waiting for the king's response, Adrian turned around and left, but he stopped halfway. "I'm sorry, your highness, but I have to take away your knife and fork." The guard captain walked to Thales' side, glanced at the stunned prince, and apologetically took away the knife and fork beside the plate. "I believe a spoon will be enough. After all, the Far Easterners can eat with only 2 thin wooden sticks." Thales looked at the guard captain with a complicated expression. "Thank you, my lord," he said hoarsely. "Thank you and Gilbert for fighting for me. A quarter of an hour." But things had already come to this. "What else can I do?" "You're welcome, your highness." Adrian smiled as he weighed the knife and fork in his hand. "By the way, your sword is indeed quite heavy. It's not easy to hold it in my hand." Thales laughed bitterly and ignored the king, whose expression was almost frozen. "That's not mine, it's Caribbean's." But Adrian didn't let him continue. "Instead," he said to himself, he continued, "but after we found its scabbard, it will be much more convenient." The guard captain of the royal guards nodded in a profound manner. After all, since ancient times, swords cannot escape its scabbard. Cannot escape its scabbard. In the next second, Thales suddenly raised his head. "What?" He looked at Adrian in surprise. Lord Adrian smiled faintly, blinked, and immediately left. As the door opened and closed, he walked out of Ballard Room. Thales stared in the direction he left in a daze. "Tormund Mallows. You son of AB*TCH, watchman, the guard captain I hate the most. Isn't he being interrogated by the flag-bearer division and unable to take care of himself? And he still has time to care about my business?" Thales clenched his fists. The door closed. The room returned to silence. "Looks like you're very popular." The king stared at the door and seemed to be deep in thought. "And this makes you feel uneasy?" Thales took a deep breath, returned to reality, and looked at his father. The king snorted coldly. "Eat." King Kessel nonchalantly grabbed his knife and fork. "Unless you want to starve and be whipped. That doesn't feel good." Thales grabbed his spoon and stared at his soup bowl. He could not fight against the king. He could not turn into another sword. Just like temple and imperial style, the source of their formation determined that they were bound to fight against each other, and they were as incompatible as fire and water. Neither of them would easily lower their heads to the other. And him. Thales stared at his own reflection in the bowl. So, he could not use the bargaining chip given by Fakenhas to negotiate terms with King Kessel. He could not hold the sword given by the Western Desert people and claim credit from Renaissance Palace. That would not work. Thales clenched the spoon in his hand and frowned slightly. Not enough. He had not given enough. Not enough. Far from enough. The sin of Hell's river surged and filled his brain, but it made him think more clearly. He had to give more. More. Since ancient times, swords cannot escape their scabbard. 1,000 blades are sealed, and they are evil. Thales stared at King Kessel, who was quietly eating. He slowly became lost in thought and gradually understood. Are you ready? Deep in his heart, a small voice reminded him. Thales? In the next second, the prince suddenly raised his head. I know. Thales fixed his gaze on King Kessel. His tone was calm and unperturbed. I know that I can't hide Amoliai's matter from you. As long as I still want to use it as a bargaining chip, I can't hide it from you, much less convince you. But Thales' tone changed. But you won't succeed, even if you have that orphan girl in your hands. But it's not because Fakenhas won't compromise, nor is it because you lack means. Kessel V did not say a word. He just lowered his head and ate. Thales sucked in a deep breath. His next words were directed at the king as well as himself. But because this is destined. The king responded to him with a cold snort. But Thales was not discouraged, nor was he impatient. He pierced a piece of what looked like a sausage with his spoon. Your Majesty, I just figured something out. That is, whether there is a Sand King or not, whether you want to centralize power, expand the army, reform, or make the country rich, no matter how many years pass, you are destined to lose everything. Across the long table, King Kessel, who was cutting meat, paused. The prince's expression did not change. He continued to focus on his plate. Remind me, how did the Sand King fail? From vision to goal to assumption, from planning to preparation to execution, it was grand, precise and logical. But at the last moment, it fell short of success. He was forced to take a step back, fold his cards to stop his losses, and win with less losses. What exactly went wrong? The king did not answer, but he slowly raised his eyes and looked at Thales. Was it the imperial conference that held each other back? The kingdom's secret intelligence department spoiled everything? The regular army was eager for quick success? The legendary wing was short-sighted? The vassals of Western Desert were shrewd and vigilant? Or the forces of the desert were unruly and uncooperative and refused to cooperate with your performance? The prince chuckled and took a bite of the sausage, but he could not taste it at all. Or is it that no one has a problem here, or is it that everyone has a problem? King Kessel did not move. He only fixed his gaze on Thales. Wait. Thales narrowed his eyes. You don't really think that it's my fault, do you? The king still did not respond. But Thales did not expect him to answer. No. The teenager snorted and laughed. The truth is, even if everything goes smoothly for the Sand King, and everyone does their duty. The second prince's gaze sharpened. It is also destined not to succeed. Because it has a link, and that itself is the biggest problem. Thales completely abandoned table manners. As he chewed, he pointed his spoon at King Kessel. You. Chapter 623. King Kessel was silent for a second before he chuckled. Me. The king put down his knife. He looked interested, but his words were cold. Let me guess, Fakenhas thinks the same? Thales shook his head. When the branches rot and the leaves rot, one must ask the root. If there is a problem with your rule, your Majesty, the first person in the kingdom to pay the bill, and the first person to reflect and hold accountable, is definitely and only you. The king's disdainful sneer rang out in the room. He lowered his head again and continued eating. Thales smiled as well, unperturbed. Yes, you probably think that if the kingdom's rule is unsatisfactory and there is a problem with Constellation's development, it must be due to the officials' deviation in execution and the poor governance of the lower ranks. Minor adjustments and corrections will not harm your grand strategy of ruling the country, nor will it harm the wisdom of the nobles before you, or the wisdom of your king. Just like the Sand King, in your eyes, how could it be wrong? It must be that the people who do things are not courageous, there must be mistakes in execution, the enemy is too cunning, there must be accidents that happen more frequently than expected, it must be that unlucky prince's problem. But, Thales's smile turned cold. Only the simplest and kindest of citizens would have such naive and beautiful fantasies. Only the most sinister and vicious scoundrels would say such slanderous words. Thales pointed at the king and said seriously, "No, the reason why the Sand King failed is because of you, your majesty." The sound of a knife clashing with a plate responded to him. Yes. Perhaps certain that victory was in his grasp, King Kessel did not even raise his head as he spoke perfunctorily. "I, the king of Constellation, am the kingdom's weakest link?" But Thales shook his head decisively. "On the contrary, your majesty Kessel." Thales smashed his spoon on the plate. "In fact, you are the strongest link in the center of the kingdom." King Kessel's knife cut the food in front of him into two. He raised his head slightly. The tip of the knife in his field of vision was facing Thales's face. "But that is precisely why I failed," the prince said calmly, as if this was the most common sense. "Your majesty, it is precisely because you are too powerful, too outstanding, too wise, too terrifying, and too decisive." King Kessel looked at Thales at the end of the knife and was silent for a while. "Flattery won't absolve you." Thales shook his head. He scooped up a spoonful of soup made of some unknown substance and put it into his mouth. "Think back, your majesty. Before the Sand King, from the Desert War until now, from Blade Fang's camp to Blessing's town, from the Emergency Control Order to the Border County Development Tax Exemption Order, from the Legendary Wing to the regular army, how many things have you done to Western Desert?" "I was caught by a boorish man in Dragon Cloud City who was one of the best in the Western Peninsula when it came to sword-wielding, but whose political IQ was said to be the lowest in the world." Thales sneered faintly. "Even though it was later proven that the reasoning logic that the Star Killer relied on to track me was simply mechanically copied and made no sense at all. That damned Ryland paper." Thales raised his head and looked straight at the king with a solemn gaze. "So, just like you, I lamented my bad luck countless times, cursed the guy who made me give myself away, and cursed that stupid logic of a lucky hit. But I never doubted my own plan and reflected on my own responsibility." King Kessel did not say a word. "I was wrong," Thales sighed and said calmly and helplessly, "because no matter how powerful my methods were, or how brilliant my schemes were, he was destined to catch me at that time and that place. Because during the 6 years of good times in Dragon Cloud City," Thales clutched his left arm tightly and sullenly said, "Sorry Nicholas, the Star Killer, regarded me as his greatest and most dangerous enemy. Sorry Nicholas, the Star Killer. He treated me as his greatest and most dangerous enemy. If he ran into an accident, he would suspect me. If he was attacked, he would be wary of me. If he made a mistake, he would look at me. If I suddenly disappeared, he would still think of me." "Even if one of the sewers in Heroic Spirit Palace was clogged," the prince sneered indignantly. "In his eyes, I must be the one playing tricks behind the scenes. It was a shocking conspiracy that I had been planning for 6 years. So I was caught, and almost brought back to Dragon Cloud City." Thales looked into the distance, which he could not see. "And later, I understood that the reason why I was targeted by him was because I was caught in a trap of my own making. I went on a rampage that night in Dragon's Blood and turned myself into the most terrifying, bizarre, and dangerous variable in Dragon Cloud City in the eyes of others. I changed the fate of all of Extet." The king listened quietly, his thoughts unknown. "It's the same in Western Desert." Thales sighed and returned to the reality before his eyes. "Especially when they see you as the strongest enemy, your majesty." King Kessel pursed his lips. "Them," the king said coldly. "With that group of selfish, fat and short-sighted rotten nobles? They are like a sheet of loose sand, fighting incessantly among themselves. They can't even unite under one flag." Thales' voice became stern. "Then it's even more impossible for them to be obedient to you." King Kessel raised his chin. "They will do it." King Kessel's gaze sharpened. He also raised his voice, resolute and unquestionable. "They have to do it. They have to." Thales smiled. And next time, there will be other people in other places, countless people, for the same reason and concern, who will use more and more complicated ways to disgust you, obstruct you and frustrate you. Thales was unusually determined. He tore the letter into pieces without hesitation. Not just the Sand King, not just the military, not just the suzerains and vassals, not just the Imperial Conference. Further away, there's the National Conference 6 years ago, New Star, and Val Arund whom you defeated. Even closer, there's the accident at the royal banquet, and Zayn's hypocritical petition that has buried countless holes in it. Thales spread his hands, letting the pieces of the letter fall to the ground. King Kessel stared at the pieces from afar, gripping the arm of his chair tightly. His eyes were filled with anger. Once their interests are harmed, their rule is in trouble, and their living space is squeezed, Thales' voice continued, sounding cold and ruthless. Their first reaction will always be to resist and counterattack, and the first target they will fight against will always be Renaissance Palace. It's you. At that moment, Thales' gaze was as sharp as a sword. Because to them, the Iron Hand King is too powerful, too terrifying. So powerful that you can't do anything. As long as you're still sitting on the throne, you're already everyone's enemy. You're bound to encounter their instinctive vigilance and resistance, whether it's on the surface or in the dark. Because to them, the Iron Hand King is too obvious, too special. Now that things have come to this, the excuse and convenience that the bloody year gave you to revive the kingdom have been used up. Your actions can no longer be hidden, and Renaissance Palace has long surpassed all threats without them realizing it, becoming their main enemy. King Kessel took a deep breath, suppressed his raging anger, and closed his eyes. But Thales was not affected at all, as if everything was within his expectations. So when you look around, there are enemies everywhere, and when you move forward, every step is arduous. So from the inside to the outside, everything is not going well for you. From the top to the bottom, nothing is going well for you. Thales shook his head gently. No, Your Majesty. You can't do anything. Can't do anything. His voice was deep and sorrowful. Can't do anything. In the next second, King Kessel suddenly opened his eyes. Alarmist. He said coldly. Eloquent and eloquent. Thales hummed in agreement and spread his hands. But there's nothing you can do. The youth's eyebrows gradually furrowed. You can defeat them, but you can't destroy them. Faced with a pile of loose sand and a mess, you are caught in a dilemma and don't know where to start. You don't even know where they will jump out to stop you, or which part of the chain will go wrong. Thales raised his eyebrows. He heard King Kessel say faintly, in a tone that he rarely heard him preach, "You're right. Moderation means compromise. Compromise means retreat. Retreat means wavering. Wavering means giving up and giving up." Kessel V paused and snorted. "It means that you've been on the wrong path from the beginning. You'll soon be trapped in their seemingly righteous, but actually sinister and cunning stance. You won't be able to control yourself." At that moment, a cold glint flashed in the king's eyes. And one day, when you're no longer in line with their interests, when you no longer respond to their cries, when you no longer cater to their wishes, you'll be opposed, despised, expelled, abandoned, and betrayed by them. King Kessel said softly, just like the Sand King in the past. The king paused and continued faintly. "And my father." But you're tuning in to the Xiaofan's Wuxia Tales YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.